Broken Dreams. A Paranormal Protector Tale. Book 3 in the Heart of Stone series. Written by Demelza Carlton. Autonarrated by AI Charlotte from Google. 38. Would you paint me? Yes, his heart and nether regions screamed, while his brain and his mouth were still floundering in shock that she'd asked him. He'd drawn her dozens of times, and she never seemed to like any of the pictures. He just wasn't good enough. After years of training, maybe he would be, but he still had a long way to go. But if Rochelle was willing to take pity on him and let him practice. He swallowed. If you let me, I'd love to. I couldn't pay you as much as the art center pays their models, so I understand if you'd rather. Pay me. Don't your clients usually pay you? She looked slightly panicky, as if she regretted the offer already. As well she might. If she hated his painting of her as much as she did the sketches, he was honor-bound to pay her, even if only for seeing her own self represented so terribly. You've seen my work. It's never quite true to life, though I try hard to make it so. And some people I just can't get right at all. I mean, that guy today loved my sketch so much he insisted he wanted a painting of it, and I only charged him for materials. Materials enough for 2 or 3 paintings, mind you, in case he didn't like the first one and made me do it over again. I'm surprised he accepted the first one as it was. I mean, it was hardly true to life. His hands were not the same in the photo, and no matter how much I tried, that fish just didn't come out the right color. Her hand landed on his, silencing him. That fish was beautiful. The whole painting was beautiful. If he hadn't liked it, you should have put it in a gallery for sale. I would have bought it, if I could afford it. As it is, with all the shifts I've been working here at the cafe and at the prison, what with not having to pay bills or much of my food, in another week or 2, I might be able to scrape up enough to pay you what that guy did, so if you're willing to wait. Ben shook his head. No, I'm the one who should pay you. I bought a phone last week, on top of everything I needed to paint the Emperor, but, if you're willing to wait until I've done another big commission or 2. Rochelle laughed. We're going to be here all night arguing if we can't decide who's paying. A customer came in then, interrupting the discussion, as Rochelle had to make several cups of coffee for the woman to take away, along with a box of cinnamon scrolls. Ben wished he'd been able to eat the pastry she'd given him instead of just enjoying the aroma, but he'd learned early on that his living stone body did not digest food, and the result of attempting to eat or drink anything was messy, to say the least. While she was distracted, he should probably toss his cold coffee into the pot plant, so she wouldn't notice he hadn't touched it. Not a moment too soon, she was already farewelling the customer and on her way back. Okay, how's this for an idea? After the cafe closes on Monday, if you're free, you come up to my place to paint me. Octavia has a sort of chaise in her photo studio up there, with some really good lighting, so we can set up and go whenever you're ready. We go halves in the cost of the materials, so we're both paying, but if I really like the painting and I want to keep it, I'll buy out your half so I can. Ben considered her offer. It was better than he deserved. All right, but if you like the painting, I'd happily give it to you. I'm getting a pretty good deal out of this anyway, seeing as I should be paying you and for all the materials, so it's only fair. It was her turn to take her time considering, but finally she nodded. All right. We have a deal. Monday night then. She gave him a tremulous smile, and for a moment, she looked as nervous as he felt about the whole arrangement. As though she had anything to be nervous about. All she had to do was sit on the couch and be her lovely self, something she did as easily as breathing, while he had to attempt to do her justice, first with a pencil and then in paint. He wasn't sure whether he wanted it to be Monday already, or if he'd prefer that Monday never came.
39.
At least a dozen times a night, Rochelle decided she was going to cancel her Monday appointment with Ben. But every time she worked up the courage to cross the cafe to tell him, a customer would come in and distract her. So when Ben arrived on Monday, she knew she had to tell him. But the moment he saw her, his face lit with a huge grin. "I've been counting down the hours until tonight. I have a new sketchbook and some new canvases, and I've bought enough paint so I don't run out. You won't regret this, I promise." She managed to mumble something about how eager she was too, before retreating behind the espresso machine. But all too soon, Tacy's cuckoo clock chirped 7 o'clock, and it was time to close the cafe. The quiet night meant she'd been able to do most of the cleaning before they closed, so all she had to do was lock the doors, turn the lights off, and take the remaining sandwiches to the fridge in the kitchen so she could have them for lunch tomorrow. Then Ben followed her upstairs. 40. Ben helped Rochelle lift the chaise into the middle of the makeshift studio, where the light was best, then chose a low plastic stool for himself. "You should probably go change out of your work clothes. You won't want me to paint you in those," Ben said, though he knew full well it was not the clothes she wore that made her dislike the pictures he'd drawn of her downstairs. He was going to mess this up, he knew it, but some desperate hope kept him here all the same. Because maybe, just maybe, he'd do a good job this time and draw something that made her smile. "All right." She vanished into the bathroom. When she emerged, she wore nothing but a towel and something underneath with cerise straps that circled her shoulders. Then the towel came off, and all he could see was her creamy skin, only slightly covered in cerise satin. He'd never seen modern undergarments on a living, breathing woman before, and he had to admit, it was lovely. So little was covered, and yet it was more than enough to tantalize. She bowed her head, following his gaze to her underwear. "It's the only matching set of underwear I have. They were on clearance because they're hot pink, but they looked okay when I tried them on, so I thought." "You look beautiful," Ben said, meaning every word. "So, you would like me to paint you in your underwear?" Her cheeks turned as pink as her drawers. "Unless you want me to take them off." Still she wouldn't look at him. He sighed. "Rochelle, I'm so grateful you would offer to model for me at all. I will paint you in anything you wish. Pink underwear. Martha Rendell's gown. Your work uniform. Or nothing at all. What I want most is to create a painting you like. So, what do you feel most comfortable wearing?" She swallowed and raised her gaze to meet his eyes. "I want to take the bra off. The underwire is digging into my boobs something awful. No wonder they were on clearance. And if I'd realized the knickers were a G-string and not normal briefs, I never would have bought them. It feels like the string up the back is trying to saw me in half, bum first. Then take them off." A pathetic pile of pink satin dropped to the floor, but she'd picked up the towel to cover herself again. Ben winced. No way did he want to draw anything with that hideous frayed towel in it. "How about you lie on the couch here on your belly? Then bring your arms up like this, one close and across your chest and the other stretched out a little. Your legs, stretch them out behind you. Or maybe bend one knee so your foot is up on the arm of the chair." He demonstrated, then gestured for her to take her place on the couch. The towel crumpled to the floor. 41. Rochelle had never felt so exposed in her life, standing there in her underwear and then only a towel, but Ben didn't stare like most men would. No, he just kept talking to her, like she was wearing her cafe blacks and not naked, as he explained how she should lie on the couch. One arm here, the other arm there, and her legs. She didn't think she had it right, but when she looked up at him, she found him nodding in approval. "I like that. The way your legs are crossed at the ankle, raised up behind you. Now your hair. Would you let it loose, please?" She ripped the elastic out of her ponytail and combed her fingers through her hair. She'd brushed and retied her hair before leaving the bathroom, but now she itched to have the brush in her hand again, if only to delay the inevitable. "Shake your head, so your hair falls naturally over your shoulders and back." Rochelle obeyed, and it felt freeing somehow. Which made absolutely no sense. "Now look at me, like you want me to show you what I'm drawing." She expected him to tell her to hold still, but the words never came. Instead, after several minutes, he would instruct her to change her pose a little, shifting her hair to one side, over her shoulder, or down over her breasts as she sat up, turning to face her body away from him, then glancing back over her shoulder. Slowly but surely she began to relax. She forgot she was naked, doing what had to be the most outrageous thing she'd ever done, and more than once she felt a smile on her lips as Ben directed her to change her position again, before stopping her with, "That's perfect." "Oh, lovely. Exactly like that." After what felt like only a few minutes but surely had been longer, Ben tossed his sketchbook and pencil onto the floor and rubbed his eyes. "I need a break." "I imagine you do too, after sitting still for so long." Rochelle shook her head. "I could do this all night. It's fun." But now she thought about it. "Maybe I could use a bathroom break," she admitted. When she emerged from the bathroom, Ben didn't even notice. He was intent on his sketchbook, frowning as he added a few more lines to something. "Can I see?" she asked, holding out her hand. "Don't you want to put some clothes on first?" he said. She should have, but now, after 3 hours, how could it have been 3 hours? With the heating turned up, she wasn't even cold. Maybe she should walk around naked more often. Well, only when the cafe was closed, of course, and the blinds were down, and there was no one to see. As if to remind her that there was still very much someone who could see her, Ben held out the sketchbook. There were no tongues sticking out this time. He'd captured every pose he'd put her in and made her look like she was actually worth painting, instead of just a failed uni student turned barista, who occasionally pretended to be a convicted killer to amuse tourists, whose ex-boyfriend didn't even pay her enough attention to notice he'd been dumped. On these pages she saw a woman with hope in her eyes, who might matter. Maybe not now, but one day, she'd be something to someone. Someone worth painting. "Thank you." She threw her arms around Ben's neck and hugged him. All right." She backed off and folded her arms across her breasts. Maybe she should get dressed and make Ben a coffee or something. Share the last cinnamon scroll with him. "Can I get you something to eat or drink? What would you like?" He closed his eyes. "With you standing there like that, the only thing I can think about is what you might taste like." A sensible person would apologize, go put some clothes on, and let Ben leave before she embarrassed him any further. But Rochelle didn't seem to be thinking straight tonight. There was something bold and daring about letting a man she barely knew sketch her naked, and she wasn't sure she was ready to go back to sensible just yet. "Which part of me exactly?" His eyes darkened. "All of you." 42. Rochelle's lips tasted sweet, but her tongue still held the bitter hint of coffee. Nor was she a novice at kissing either. He could happily kiss her all night, breathing her in as he tasted and tasted and tasted. But her breasts begged for his attention, so he kissed his way down her throat to the silken softness of her left breast, trembling slightly with each beat of her heart. He expected the pink pearl of her nipple to taste smooth and sweet, like her lips, but instead they were faintly salty. Yes, both of them, for he was nothing if not thorough. Rochelle moaned, throwing her head back, which pushed her breasts toward him like an offering, an invitation. One he could not refuse. He carried her to the couch, and laid her on the red velvet, looking his fill as the light caressed her breasts, before he lowered his head for another taste. Finally, he could stand it no more. He kissed his way down her belly, stroking her thighs until they parted for him. He breathed in her scent. Salt, yes, but something muskier, more earthy too. Then? Worried eyes looked askance at him. Had he gone too far? I want to taste all of you, he said. But I haven't, I've never, no one's ever. Uncertainty crept into her tone. I've never done this before either. Would you be willing to share your first time with me? I promise I will make it pleasurable for you. He knew how to give her pleasure, and he knew she would make it very clear if she did not enjoy his attentions. A gentleman would have taken her hesitation as his cue to withdraw, and maybe even leave. But Ben was no gentleman. He blew a warm breath between her legs, making her shiver, before he pressed his lips to hers again for a slow, languorous kiss. She responded eagerly, her tongue ready to dance once more, but he still had one hand between her thighs, stroking lightly ever upward until he touched upon a spot that made her gasp. Then moan. Before she began to writhe beneath him, lifting her hips as if she wanted him to give her far more than just his calloused fingers. Let me taste you, he whispered in her ear before swooping down and sucking hard on her nipple on his way lower still. She was perilously close to release, so close he feared he would not be able to deny her that promised pleasure for a moment longer. Yes, oh yes, she cried. Not a moment too soon. Her orgasm burst like nectar on his tongue, for surely this was the wine of the ancient gods. Wine he must taste again and again until he drunk his fill. 43. Wait, was that his tongue? Or his fingers? Or both, twisting her insides until something inside her was about to, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. When she could breathe again, no, when there was enough oxygen reaching her brain so she could think again, she knew for certain that had to be the finest orgasm she'd ever had. Actually, the first orgasm any man had ever given her, and Ben hadn't even taken his clothes off. I want more than your fingers and your mouth. Please take me to bed, Ben. His eyes regarded her wickedly from between her thighs. But I'm not done tasting you yet. Wait, he couldn't possibly give her another one? This soon after the first? Please, Ben, she begged as her breath grew short. Impossible as it was, he was about to, Ben, oh my God, Ben, OHMYGOD. When she opened her eyes, the first thing she saw was him licking his fingers, that same wicked smile still on his face. You have to be the most delicious thing I've ever tasted. I could do this all night. She pushed herself up into a sitting position and he backed up a little, though his hand didn't stop stroking her thigh. So she reached down and did a little stroking of her own. He was rock hard and definitely ready for her. Bigger than she'd expected to, though not uncomfortably so. I want to go to bed with you. I want this. She gave him a squeeze and his eyes widened. Then they grew impossibly dark. If you want me, then you shall have me. He lifted her up, like she weighed nothing, and set her in the middle of the bed. He made short work of his clothes, so she scarcely had time to take him all in before he was climbing onto the bed, pushing her legs apart, until his hard length rested against her thigh, poised to grant all her wishes. Condom. She didn't have any condoms. But there was Octavia's condom collection. Surely she wouldn't miss one. Rochelle opened the drawer of the bedside cabinet, and fished about until her fingers closed on a foil packet. Here. She tossed it to Ben. He caught it, then stared at it. What is this? Oh shit. It wasn't one of the really weird ones, was it? Lime green with hints of orange. Not the alien one with the tentacles? She breathed a sigh of relief as she realized it was just a Ninja Turtle one. The orange one, whatever his name was. Here, I'll put it on for you, she said, ripping open the packet. So hot and hard in her hands, he'd feel even better inside her. There, she breathed. Now, whatever happened to if you want me, you shall have me. 44. The thin sheath was called a condom, he recalled faintly from something he'd seen in one of the health classes at the art college. An ingenious device that prevented disease and pregnancy while not impeding sensation, as Rochelle had demonstrated as she'd rolled it up his length. Just the feel of her hands on him, it was almost enough to send him over the edge. But she was wet and waiting for him. He didn't dare disappoint her. She moaned as he entered her, her slick heat embracing him tightly like nothing he'd ever felt before. Inch by glorious inch, he pushed his way deeper inside her until he filled her to the hilt. Maybe he had died and this was heaven. It sure felt like it. Yes, oh yes, she sighed. He was supposed to move, wasn't he? He didn't want to. He wanted to stay here like this, buried deep inside her forever. But then he did move slowly out before thrusting in again, her inner walls stroking his length far more thoroughly than her hand or his ever could. He wanted to savor every second of this, his first night with her. Finally, he understood why men were mad enough to marry or take a mistress. To be able to enjoy the bliss of Rochelle's body every night, heaven indeed. You can move a little faster, you know, Rochelle said. You won't break me. And if you move faster, you'll come faster too. A faint blush colored her cheeks. He waited until he was once again buried balls deep inside her before he said, "And why would I want this to be over faster? Though you taste more salty than sweet, yours is the sweetest, most exquisite muff I have ever had the honor of entering. I mean to enjoy every moment." Realization dawned and he grinned. "Oh, but I will enjoy this even more if you were to come faster than me." He reached down and pressed his thumb against that little bundle of nerves that made her gasp and began to grind against it, his gaze never leaving hers. Her breathing grew shallow, her eyes glazing just a little as she let out a breathless whimper. It was all the warning he had before her inner walls began to convulse around him, squeezing him so tightly he feared she would trap him inside her forever, until she gave a little sob and a shudder and released him. "Oh my God, Ben, that was... Her eyes shone with the words that she could not seem to say. Or maybe it was because her breathing had grown shallow again, as he coaxed her firmly toward the next in many more orgasms. "Come for me again," he commanded. 45. Rochelle lost count. Every time he purred, "Come for me," she could not help but obey, as if the combination of his fingers and his dick worked some sort of magic on her. Throughout it all, he did not let up his relentlessly steady pace, thrusting deep inside her just as slowly in and out as he'd begun. He might have given her more than a dozen orgasms, yet she hadn't given him a single one. Maybe Jakob was right, and she was terrible in bed. "Come with me, sweet lass," Ben said, his fingers slowing to match his thrust now. "One more time." She wasn't sure if her body could bear any more pleasure without exploding into a million pieces, but she could no more resist the pull of this next orgasm than she could resist gravity. For this one seemed to build deep inside her, overshadowing the pleasurable sparks where his fingers rubbed her clit. With every thrust, he was turning her core molten into a volcano ready to explode. She could not hold it much longer. Any moment, she was going to lose all control and... "Come for me. Now." She screamed his name as pleasure erupted all over her body, from head to fingers to curled toes. This time, when she opened her eyes, she found him staring at her with the same sort of wonder in his expression that she felt. Was it? Did you finally come? Was it as good for you as it was for me?" She couldn't seem to get the words out. Maybe it was because he was still inside her, setting off aftershocks, though he wasn't moving anymore. Ben leaned down and kissed her. "That was the most spectacular sex I have ever known. I want to ask you to marry me right now, just so we can do that again." Rochelle held her breath. If he asked right now, she'd be mad enough to say yes. He laughed, as if it was all a big joke. Her heart plummeted. So this was only a one-night stand, mind-blowing though the sex had been, and they would likely never do it again. She shifted, freeing her body from his so she could escape to the bathroom. "I'll just go clean myself up," she said with forced lightness as the tears began to fall. Tears he could not see, for she was facing away from him. 46. Ben instantly knew he'd said something wrong. In a moment she'd gone from beaming postcoital bliss to bursting into tears, though she'd tried to hide it well. Which meant he must have said something wrong. The question was, what? He'd complimented her on the excellent sex, then asked her to marry him. Neither were the sort of things that normally upset a woman, but women were mysterious creatures after all. He needed to make this right, but it was hard to know how when he didn't know what he'd done wrong. Unless it was because he should have proposed before indulging in such excellent sex, that might be it. He would just have to explain to her that a few hours hardly mattered in the overall scheme of things, or even a few days for that matter, and he would happily become her husband if she would but name the date. He folded his arms behind his head and stretched out on the bed, imagining bedding her again on their wedding night, and every night after. She appeared in the bathroom doorway. Yearning burned in her eyes as she gazed at him, before their eyes met for only a moment, and she turned away. But not before he saw her tears. "Rochelle, wait." He followed her to the bathroom, where he found her standing before the mirror, splashing water on her face as though it might hide her tears. "I meant what I said. About wanting to do that again. Every night for the rest of their lives," he wanted to add, but caution told him to hold his tongue. "That's the problem, isn't it? So do I. What girl wouldn't? When you look like, well, that." She waved her hand at his body. He didn't need to glance down. He looked no different from any other man. Well, he was more wiry than Torsten and a little shorter than Dunstan, but he was big enough to provide Rochelle with all the pleasure and protection she could ever need. Unless the men of this time were more different than he realized. "What do I look like to you?" he asked. She let out a harsh little laugh. "You look like one of those statues in Rome. The ones of ancient heroes, naked in all their glory with cape and helmet and nothing else, standing proudly on their plinths for everyone to stare at in wonder. All muscles and mastery and mighty manhood. With your skills, you could make a fortune selling self-portraits. Social media would go mad for you. I'm surprised you aren't already a social media sensation. You're a walking thirst trap. And then there's me. I don't know why you're so nice to me. Why you persist in drawing me, when you know the pictures aren't going to turn out pretty. Why you'd bother to sleep with me when you could have anyone at all, instead of just me. And tonight was so incredible, no one else will ever be able to compare. So I'll spend the rest of my life wishing for one more night with you." No, Ben still didn't understand. "If you want me, you shall have me." "But for how long?" She shook her head. "No, I've made a terrible mistake, and I don't know how to fix it." He stepped forward, arms spread wide. "Then tell me what it is, so I can help you fix it." She laughed. "I asked you to paint me in the hope that you might see me as someone worth painting. That I might feel like that. And then I look at you and realize I don't want a painting of me at all. I want a painting of you just like you were on the bed a moment ago, so that I might remember this night, and the way you looked at me, and maybe one day I will see what you saw, that I will be someone worth painting. Then I will do dozens of sketches of our time together. And you shall choose the best of them, the one you like most, and I will paint it for you. Because you are someone worth painting, even if you cannot see it yourself. You're beautiful and kind, and you see the world as a true artist, as anyone who has seen the effort you put into your coffee art will tell you. Tonight you have allowed me to see your beauty in all its glory, to draw and maybe even paint you, before you became kindness itself, and allowed me to share your bed, to touch and taste instead of just look. I cannot even begin to repay you for what you have given me tonight, which has been the best night of my life. I would happily spend the rest of my life, painting every moment of our night together, so I don't forget a single second." She laughed through her tears. "God, that sounds awful. Spending the rest of your life painting me, when there are so many other things you could be doing. Then what would you have me do to make you happy?" For he would do anything to chase her tears away. Rochelle should never cry for him. "Well, in the absence of you spending the rest of your life painting me or making love to me, I suppose I need to be realistic. I'd love a painting with you in it, and if we only have one night together, I'd like you to make love to me one more time and then come to bed with me so that I can fall asleep in your arms afterwards." He would give her all those things and more if she would only allow it, but he would start with the simplest thing first. "Then lean forward and put your hands on the wall." 47. "What did you say?" Rochelle turned around so she was looking at his face and not his reflection. But he'd stepped forward, so he stood right behind her, crowding her against the bathroom counter. His eyes had gone dark again. "Lean forward and put your hands on the wall." She did as he asked, which of course meant her backside pushed out behind her where it met his once again hard cock. He wrapped one arm around her breasts, pulling her against him. "I said keep your hands on the wall." She leaned forward again, planting her hands on either side of the mirror, so she could at least fire a questioning glance at his reflection. But he was looking down, not meeting her gaze at all. A moment later, she realized why, as the hard heat of him pushed between her thighs before thrusting deep inside her. Not slow like before at all. Now his eyes were on her, capturing her gaze so she couldn't look away. "Before you said you wanted me to take you hard and fast. A moment ago you wanted me to take you back to bed, to make love to you. What do you want, Rochelle?" He could see her soul, she was sure of it. She squirmed internally, which she should not have done, because with his dick so deep inside her, he surely felt it too. "I want you." The words burst out of her before she'd really thought them through, but they were true. "And I want you right here and now. Do you believe me?" His dick moved deep within her, rubbing against her most sensitive spots all at once, setting her insides on fire. "Do you feel that?" Mutely, she nodded. "I'm hard for you, Rochelle, to pleasure you." God, it felt like her insides were melting. How was he doing this? "Do you know what I want?" She wet her lips, though her mouth had become terribly dry. She hardly dared believe it, but she had to say it. In case it was true. "You want me." The words hung in the air, a whisper of power that could become a roar if she only dared to believe him. "I want you more than anything. Do you believe me?" He didn't wait for an answer. Instead, he began to withdraw. "No," she cried, pushing back against him. "You don't believe me." "I don't want you to stop. I want to believe you. I just... Can you feel how hard I am for you? How much I want you?" He drove deep into her, not once but over and over, fast and hard, and oh, it felt so good. "Yes," was all she could manage to say. "Do you believe me now?" "Yes." "Will you come for me?" As many times as he wanted. "Yes." "When you come for me, will you scream my name?" "Yes." He pounded into her, relentless as the waves against the sea wall in the harbor, and she surrendered herself to the sensation, body and soul, until the first orgasm ripped through her, and she did scream his name not once but over and over until she was breathless. But Ben did not relent, and she had no wish for him to stop. When he did eventually withdraw from her, heedless of her cries for him to continue, her knees buckled, for her legs were too weak to hold her up anymore. Ben carried her to bed, laughingly pushing her hands away from his groin when she begged for more. "You cannot fit a lifetime of sex into one night, lass, no matter how much you'd like to. We can do it again tomorrow, after you've slept. Now rest. With his strong arms around her and her whole body thrumming from all the wondrous sex, Rochelle drifted off to sleep, her dreams filled with wondering how they might make love in the morning. 48. The sun was well and truly up when Rochelle woke the next morning, and Ben was gone. On the pillow where his head had rested when she'd fallen asleep, he'd left his sketchbook, with a sticky note on the front that only said, "See you tonight. B." He had the strangest handwriting, more like curly calligraphy than the sort of printing she'd used to scribble a note. Actually, the only time she'd seen writing like his, outside of actual professional calligraphy, was in the early prison records. As an artist and a lover, he had superior skills that set him apart from everyone else. It shouldn't come as a surprise to her to discover he was an expert calligrapher, too. Rochelle could hear Tacy clattering around in the kitchen downstairs, so the cafe must already be open. She should probably have a shower and open up the windows to get rid of the sex smell before she headed down to get breakfast. Her nether regions were tender and aching both inside and out, and she winced a little as she made herself wash thoroughly. Maybe she should do as Ben said, and not try to squeeze a year's worth of sex into one night. But when the sex was so incredible, so irresistible, so damn addictive, how could she have stopped? It wasn't just her private parts that had worked overtime last night, she discovered as her thighs burned all the way down the stairs. Tacy was too busy to notice Rochelle's hobbling as she flipped muffins out of their pans and stacked them all in the cabinet. But a voice came from the other side of the counter, loud and clear. "Who have you been riding so hard he's made you bow-legged? I want his name and number." Rochelle gave a little moan of relief as she hit flat ground. Her thighs didn't ache quite so much walking normally. Only then could she see who was teasing her. Callie, Tacy's housemate and a lecturer at the university, grinned at her over a large cup of something. She had a pen and notepad and everything, which she pushed across the table toward Rochelle. "He's got to be good if you can barely walk after." Then she frowned. "Unless it was something not good and I need to cast a curse on someone. I know some good ones." She wiggled her fingers. Rochelle was never sure if Callie was serious about witchcraft or not. Oh, she spoke Latin and was fluent in Viking runes, and she had an impressive collection of arcane books dating back centuries. But Tacy swore Callie wasn't actually a witch because magic didn't exist, but she liked to pretend, especially when some of her particularly religious colleagues at the university made life difficult. "No, I haven't heard from Jakob since I left him." Which was odd, come to think of it. Surely he'd have come to find her when dinner wasn't on the table. Ben came to visit last night. He wanted to build his portfolio, and I offered to model for him. So many poses, we were at it for hours. "Oh, I don't doubt it." Callie winked. "So, did you go through much of Octavia's condom collection?" Rochelle's cheeks heated. Tacy smacked a muffin down in front of Callie. "Stop teasing her or I'll tell her why you're here instead of at work. Ben's our artist in residence in the evenings at the cafe. If you want to meet him, come down any night. He takes commissions and he's evidently looking for more models to build his portfolio. And he's as virile as a bunny evidently," Callie added, taking a huge bite of her muffin. "Honestly." "Right, you asked for it." Tacy turned to Rochelle. "Callie's here because her office is being exorcised for the second time this month, because someone thinks she's been summoning Mothman demons and releasing them in Fremantle." Callie shrugged. "Can't summon what doesn't exist. I did find a good demon summoning spell, though. It'd be fun to try, just to see what happens. The ingredients looked like they'd be hard to find, though." "Well, as long as the spell doesn't involve toilet paper and hand sanitizer, maybe we should try it on our next girls' night," Tacy said. "Want to come?" Rochelle shook her head. "I'll probably be working anyway. You guys have fun." I'll just grab a coffee and go back upstairs for a bit. Ben's sketchbook was still on his pillow when Rochelle returned to her apartment. She might as well take another look at his work, seeing as he'd probably ask her tonight which one was her favorite. She leafed through the pages, admiring his work but wishing it didn't all look like, well, her. Ordinary and awkward and not the slightest bit sexy. When she reached the last one, she sighed. If only Ben had drawn a self-portrait like she'd asked. She took a big gulp of coffee as she flipped through the remaining pages, not quite daring to hope as she looked anyway. The first sketch she saw made her spit her coffee out, spraying all the way across the table. Rochelle rushed to clean up the mess before it could drip onto the floor. Thankfully, she'd missed the sketchbook, which she didn't pick up again until she was certain the table was clean and dry. What she saw this time made her mouth drop open, but as it was empty this time, she forced herself to keep turning the pages. She'd never seen anything so erotic in her life. Nope, not even in one of Jakob's pirated porn films. This was, well, it had to be her, but... A pair of breasts cupped in a man's hands. 2 legs spread wide showing, that couldn't possibly be her private parts, could it? Then several more of the same pussy, with a man's hands glistening with moisture as he fingered, stroked and teased the lucky woman. Rochelle turned the page. 2 more sketches from the same angle, only this time you could see more of the woman, arching her back and crying out as the man's fingers plunged deep inside her, and her hand clutching the sheet in either desperation or ecstasy. His penis resting against her leg, readying to enter her glistening depths. Rochelle wasn't sure how Ben could make a simple pencil sketch glisten like that, but somehow he'd managed it. Below it, his penis again, dripping wet as he withdrew from her, and on the next page, yes, that was her all right, hands fisting the sheets as she stared rapturously at Ben, who was buried so deep inside her you could only see a hint of his shaft through his hair. Then 2 whole pages on just her face, the expression she'd evidently worn while they'd bonked like bunnies, to use Callie's animal imagery. She didn't look too bad in these ones, she had to admit. Wide dreamy eyes and a blissful smile suited her, or maybe Ben had just made her look prettier than she was for these. Because these were surely the results of all the orgasms he'd given her last night. After the gallery of her pulling faces, he'd decided to draw them having sex in the bathroom. The first few pages were vignettes, close-ups of, well, his penis and her bottom mostly, as even with her leaning over, her private parts hadn't exactly been in full view. But then there were the pictures in the mirror, which she'd been too busy paying attention to last night. Her hands clenched around the mirror frame. His hands clutching her breasts as he'd pounded into her. Her blissful expression, mouth opening as though she was singing some variation on Hallelujah, when she knew she'd been screaming his name. His reflection in the mirror, from about the waist up, all chiseled muscle in deep shadow, and his face even more shadowed still as he stared directly at her. The desire in his eyes. Rochelle gulped. She was pretty sure her underwear was soaked through if they hadn't melted entirely, and all she was doing was looking at a pencil sketch of his reflection. How would she manage to work in the same cafe with him without throwing herself at him? Work tonight was going to be torture. She turned the page. Oh. My. God. Hey Rochelle? Are you coming down to mind the cafe while I take Rory to school? Just that you said you'd be down an hour ago, and if we don't leave now, she'll be late. Rochelle blinked. It took her a long moment to tear her eyes away from the image, but she managed it, barely. Even as she made her way down the steps, the image remained branded to the back of her retina, like she'd stared at the sun too long. 2 cappuccinos and 2 macadamia muffins, coming right up. No wonder he'd drawn so many of those vignettes. He'd wanted to get all the details right. Here's your espresso, sir. Oh, don't forget your Afghan cookie. Then he'd painstakingly assembled them into one amazingly detailed picture, that. Let me just check I have this right. 1 caramel macchiato with soy milk, 1 oat milk mochaccino, a Vienna chocolate with coconut milk and coconut cream, 1 dirty chai and 2 flat whites with skim milk. And for the food, 6 bacon and egg cups, 3 gluten-free, 3 wholemeal plus 3 chocolate muffins, 1 blueberry and 2 of the raspberry friands. Did I miss anything? Ben hadn't. She could have stared at the sketch for hours, drinking it all in. She had stared at it for at least an hour, according to Tacy. Good thing Tacy hadn't come upstairs and actually looked at it. I'm sorry ma'am, you said you want 5 baby Cinos without the froth? You know that's just milk, right? It was just a picture, for fuck's sake. A pencil sketch that captured the vaguest representation of a moment in time, that even she couldn't remember that clearly. Right, so that's 5 baby Cinos with no froth and 2 Vienna chocolates with skim milk. And 2 slices of the devil's own cheesecake. Did you want these to dine in or take away? It made her want to go buy a vibrator. Because just thinking about that picture, let alone looking at it, made her ache with longing to feel him inside her again. Except how could a machine feel anything like a living, breathing, thrusting human? What she really wanted was a big box of condoms, and Ben in her bed forever. Was that so wrong? Sorry I'm late. There was an accident out the front of Rory's school, and 2 mothers screaming in the middle of the street, blocking off all traffic, as they both blamed each other for the accident. They were both driving down the middle of the street though, so it's anyone's guess. The police had just arrived when I finally managed to get out of there. Tacy tied on her apron. Now shoo. Go do an assignment or catch up on sleep or wash your sheets or whatever you do until you start your shift at 5 o'clock. Well, she could go buy some condoms. Ben would be back tonight, he'd said, and if there was one person she could rely on, it was him. He'd been nothing but honest with her since the day they met. Hadn't he? 49. For a Tuesday night, the cafe was unusually busy. Rochelle hadn't had a chance to give him more than a nod of greeting from across the room as she served customer after customer, and brewed an ocean of coffee. Even when the clock chimed 7, there were still customers sitting at the tables, so Rochelle had to clean up around them, and it was another hour before she could close the cafe completely and turn the lights out. She was dead on her feet, using the broom for support, when she finally came to his table. Did you see my sketches? Do you have a favorite? Ben asked eagerly. A rosy blush colored her cheeks. Yes, but I want to discuss it with you before you turn it into a painting. Upstairs. Lead the way, he responded, only too happy to follow her. The book lay closed on the table, and she clutched it to her chest for a long moment before she began. Look, your drawings are lovely. Very detailed. Ben nodded. He prided himself on the accuracy of every anatomical detail, especially for sketches of this nature. The better they were, the better he'd been paid for them, at least in the past. The more I looked at them, the more I got to thinking. You've evidently drawn a lot of people in a state of undress. Yet you told me once there weren't any life drawing classes where you used to live in Scotland. So if you weren't drawing models, am I just the last in a long line of conquests, women that you sleep with and then sketch, and that's why you only give them one night, because once you've taken their likeness, you're not interested anymore and you move on to someone else with different shaped boobs or a more interesting face or... She swallowed. Am I just a body to you? Somebody you can order about and pose like a doll, so that you might draw an interesting picture, and that's all? How many women like me are there? He wanted to laugh, but that would not be fair. It wasn't Rochelle's fault he hadn't told her. So he said, I swear to you, there are no women like you anywhere. At least not that I've met. You are the only woman I have ever entrusted with my sketchbook. But I will not deny I have had a great deal of practice drawing naked people. He sighed. If you wish to know the truth, which I believe you deserve after last night, then I will tell you 2 secrets that I have never told anyone. But only if you trust me, for we are alone here tonight. She began to laugh. Why wouldn't I trust you? We were up here alone last night, and I never felt unsafe for a moment. Either times had changed, or Rochelle truly was unique in her view of the world. Last night I persuaded you to strip naked, permit me to draw your bare body before I stole your virtue, then took my pleasure of you not once but twice before spending the night in your bed. Back home, that would have your father threatening to come after me with a horsewhip. She frowned. I think my father has a bullwhip on the station and probably a collection of riding crops, but I can't recall the last time anyone actually used one of them on any of the stock, let alone a person. That's barbaric. As for virtue, by which I think you mean virginity, that boat sailed a long time ago, when Jacob and I were still at high school. I'm not sure I have any virtue left to steal. As for the pleasure you took, I'm pretty sure you gave way more than you received, so if we're keeping score, I probably owe you. But the drawings and the secrets, yes, I would like to know the truth, please. Because half of me wants to drag you to my bed and have my wicked way with you all night, while the other half is screaming about how little I know you. Ben ducked his head. Very well. Then my first secret is that I had never lain with a woman until last night. The most I had ever done was kiss a girl, and that was a very long time ago, back in Scotland. Her mouth dropped open. I don't believe it. You knew my body better than I did. You made me come so many times I lost count, and that was before you even got naked. You can't possibly have been a virgin yesterday. Yet I was. You might say my knowledge was all theory and observation, with no application, until last night. I drew a great number of pictures afterward, because I could not sleep. Could not stop thinking about the delightful feel of your body twined about mine, and I did not want to forget a single moment of our night together. But I realized after I drew them that those pictures might be compromising to you and to myself, which is why I left it with you, for I know you will keep it safe. A pity he had not thought to keep his other sketchbooks hidden back in Scotland, but he had been young and naive then, and he would not make the same mistake again. That's why you wanted to taste everything and take the first time so slowly. Because it was your first time. But the second time? Her cheeks turned pink again. The second time I did not hold back. Ben grinned at the memory. Rochelle had not held back either, and if she was willing to let him share her bed again, he hoped their third time would be even more pleasurable for both of them. So you believe my first secret now? He pressed. Rochelle nodded. I think so, yes. I'm ready for the second one. No, she probably wasn't. He wasn't sure he was ready to tell it. But before there could be a third time, she needed to know. For he had no right to keep such a secret from her. 50. Ben took a deep breath. Back home, there weren't many art classes, at least not ones my family could afford, so I drew whatever I could. Borrowed books on drawing. Until I was late coming home from school one day and I went past the pub. We had 2 pubs in the village. One in the middle of town and one on the edge, along the road to Glasgow. Anyway, it was getting dark, and there was a bit of a party going on at the Edge Tavern. A man and a woman were half hanging out the window, naked as the day they were born, just like some of the pictures in the Italian art book I'd borrowed. Now, I didn't know they were having sex at the time, but I was so eager to draw them that I took out my sketchbook and pencils and, well, one of the pub staff saw me and tried to shoo me away, but I explained why I wanted to draw them, how the couple looked like a religious painting I'd seen in a book. At this point, he was laughing so hard he could scarcely speak, as he dragged me inside to see the manager. Not the manager, but actually the brothel madam, I later found out. She found my story funny too, but she also knew my mother, and she felt that if my mother were not about to educate me about such matters, then she would take it upon herself. Rochelle let out a horrified cry. That's horrible. How old were you? Ben shrugged. I was about 10 or 12. Old enough to know where baby sheep and cows come from, and she said, old enough to know what husbands do to their wives as well as their whores. So she took me through the secret passageways of the place, right up to the attic, and showed me all the peepholes so that I might see what really went on. How it was nothing like religious art, and in some cases was about as wicked as could be. But I was just a boy, and I found it fascinating. I later discovered the painting I'd seen was actually a depiction of hell or judgment or some such, which explained why it had so many writhing bodies, but that didn't change my mind. If I could learn to draw these people, then maybe I could become good enough to paint on the walls of churches, or at least that's what I thought. So I asked the madam if she might let me draw what I saw. I suspect she thought I would tire of it soon enough, so she agreed. I saw all manner of things. Bodies of all shapes and sizes in countless different positions. I learned to draw fast, to capture a person in as few lines as possible, as I could flesh the picture out later as it were. I learned to draw faces in every expression imaginable. To the madam's regret, I did not tire of her establishment at all. One night, a man beat a girl so badly he broke her arm, before he ran out of the place without paying. 2 of the inn's men went after him, armed with my sketch, so that they could identify him. While the madam never told me the details, she did say that they'd never have caught him if not for my picture, and I was permitted to spend as much time in the brothel's secret passages as I wanted. My brothers were off working at their apprenticeships by then, and with my mother gone, father spent all his time managing the small farm where we lived, so no one cared if I spent every afternoon in the brothel as long as I came home for dinner, which of course I did. One day, I saw a man sitting in the parlor, leafing through some picture books I'd never noticed before. When the room was empty, I sneaked in and took a look for myself. The pictures were the erotic kind, with a great deal of attention paid to the bodies of the people in them, and very little to their faces. I asked the madam about them, and she said they were printed in London. She even showed me the address. So when I had a few coins to spare, I wrote a letter to the printer, enclosing some examples of my work. The reply came quick. There was money in the envelope, and a promise of more if I could send them other sketches just like them. From that moment, I began to see a future I had not dared to dream of before. One where I might have the money to attend art school in Italy, if I could only sell enough pictures. Some nights, they hosted an illegal boxing ring, where the fighters were as dirty as their tactics. The reigning champion, an Irishman who went by the name of Russian Vlad, taught me to fight over the years. I even ventured into the ring once or twice. The prize money was not much, but the trick was to bet on myself and make sure the odds made the other man look far more likely to win, because when I won, the wagers were where the money was. I'd almost made enough money to pay for my passage to Italy when my father died. My brother had finished his apprenticeship then, so he took me on as his apprentice. We moved around a lot wherever the work was, but it was steady work, and I still found time to draw. I was friends with a girl, an artist like me, only she'd had lessons and everything. She painted the loveliest landscapes. Watercolors, mostly. Anyway, she got hurt, and the police arrested me as a suspect. When they searched my house, they found my sketchbooks and took them as evidence. They said the pictures were of her, or what I imagined she looked like, though they looked nothing like her, and they were proof that I had planned the terrible things she suffered. They sent me to prison. He half expected Rochelle to recoil in horror, but the only movement she made was to wipe her tears away with her hands. "Oh Ben, I'm so sorry. Your friend, was she all right afterward?" Almost as if she knew. "She died." Rochelle nodded, as if she'd expected that. "I never touched her. Not that night, or any other. I'd never even kissed her, though I would have if she'd asked me to. And they never did catch the man who did it. The man was likely dead now, out of reach. Rotting in hell, hopefully. I behaved myself. Did my time, so as soon as I could, I managed to come to Australia, where I've been trying to build a new life. But even though I'm half a world away, it's like she still haunts me. Because even if I wasn't the one who killed her, I wasn't there when she needed me. I said she could come to me for help with anything, and the one time she did, I wasn't there. 51. Rochelle bowed her head. She hadn't wanted to be right about him spending time in a juvenile prison, but she couldn't have guessed that he'd be sent there for a crime he hadn't committed. That was just horrible. How anyone could have. Surely there would have been DNA evidence of the real culprit. Forensics could have found something. She opened her mouth to ask why. But one look at his bowed head, his slumped shoulders, she closed her mouth again. She couldn't say any of it. Somehow along the way, this amazing man had made peace with the horrible injustice that had been done to him, and here he was, trying to make a new life. The sort of life he deserved. Realization dawned at how a man like Ben could still be a virgin. You haven't drawn or gotten close to anyone since she died, have you? Rochelle asked, almost afraid of the answer. Not until last night with you. She wasn't sure whether to be horrified at how much he'd suffered, or honored that he'd trusted her enough to share his story with her. To share everything with her. Rochelle threw her arms around Ben's neck and hugged him. His arms closed around her, returning the embrace. They might have stood there for an eternity or only a moment, she did not know, but when they parted, it was only so that she could see his face as she said, I know which picture I want you to paint. She flipped to the final sketch and stroked her hand across it. This one. I only have to glance at it and I can feel it, feel you, as though I was there. I would give anything to feel that again, even if it's just a memory. Ben snorted. Even now you know you had sex with an ex-convict, who by his 16th birthday knew more about sex than any whore alive, though I'd never done more than kiss a girl? You could have fooled me. Last night was incredible. Rochelle untied her apron, then let her pants and underwear slide to the floor. Your past doesn't change anything. It's not who you are. She pushed him down into a chair, then straddled him. She could feel him hot and hard between her thighs. She pulled her shirt over her head, then reached back to unhook her bra. You're mad. I just told you I'm a convicted killer, and you still want me? His hands flew up, hovering over her skin but not quite close enough to touch. Like he didn't trust himself. But you didn't kill her. You might not have saved her from the man who did, but you didn't kill her. No wonder he was always so gallant, wanting to walk her home. Rochelle closed her eyes and began to grind against him, wishing he was naked too. No, but how can you stand making love to a monster? He stabbed a finger at the picture of them together last night. He did look dark there, almost like he wanted to devour her. If only he'd look at her like that now, she'd come on the spot. In just one night, you gave me more orgasms than I've had in years sleeping with Jacob. And every single one of them was better than anything I've ever felt before. If that's what making love to a monster is like, then you've ruined me for normal men for life. I only want monster cock from here on in. She reached into his pants for the member in question, and together they shuffled his pants off so he was naked from the waist down. His shirt sailed across the room where it would no longer get in the way, as she raised herself up just enough so that in one thrust he'd be inside her. Oh wait, they still needed. I bought condoms, they both said at the same time, then laughed. Rochelle dug out the biggest box she'd been able to find and held it out. Ben's box was smaller, but the pictures were a lot more. Holy hell, they hadn't sold those in Kohl's. The lady in the shop said these would give you the most pleasure. I promised I would return for more if they meet with your approval, Ben said, but she wasn't listening. She was too busy reading the description on the back of the box. Ribbed, with a little extra. Her mouth was so dry the words just wouldn't come out. So she ripped open a packet and rolled it down his length. She had to stop to admire the result. Wow. I've always dreamed of doing a guy with a ribbed cock, but I never thought it would actually happen." She might have been imagining it, but the ridges seemed to bulge out even more as she stared at him, licking her lips. "Then I need." He grabbed her hips and pulled her into his lap. He filled her with one perfectly aimed thrust, and she was soon far too busy focusing on the sensations rippling through her body to say another word. 52. He made love to her until she was thoroughly sated. Perhaps a little too thoroughly, for her even breathing as her head rested on his chest seemed to say she'd fallen asleep. Reluctantly he pulled the covers up over them both, for he had no intention of letting go of this amazing woman, at least until dawn forced him to. Such fragile strength demanded his protection, despite the demands from his brother's shades for vengeance. His brothers had waited for more than a century. Another day, another week, even another decade would make no difference. If he'd known how addictive he would find the soft yielding of her body as she embraced him, all of him, both the monstrous and the good, and the sweet sound of her cries of pleasure that only he could elicit from her, roaring to a crescendo as she screamed his name when she reached her peak. Even now, as she drifted into sleep that her fragile human body surely needed, he wanted to kiss her awake, slip his fingers between her thighs and caress her into a state of shuddering bliss. But he resisted. The sooner she surrendered to her dreams, the sooner he could start work on her painting, perhaps the most erotic work he had ever created, for unlike the hundreds of sketches he'd done of other people coupling, this was him and the woman he loved, with so much feeling infused in every stroke of his pencil as he'd stroked into her, over and over and over as she begged for more. Because, against all odds, Rochelle wanted him and only him. Perhaps he should find that man's calling card, that loose iblis, and set him on the search for the butcher instead. Let the creature of darkness seek vengeance for his brothers, leaving Ben free to love Rochelle and live. Where was the card? He tucked it into his sketchbook surely. Carefully, Ben slipped out of Rochelle's embrace and padded to the table where he'd left his satchel. He'd gone from one sketchbook to a dozen, straining the bag seams. Soon he'd have to leave some of them behind when he came to the cafe, for the bag would not hold them all. Perhaps Rochelle would agree to keep them safe for him. As long as nothing untoward happened to her. As if he'd summoned her with a thought, her warm body slid into his lap, rubbing against him in the most tantalizing way, as though she was not as satisfied as he'd believed. "What are these?" "Oh, are these the sketches from your life drawing class?" She leaned forward for a better look, heedless of the way that pressed her bottom harder against his groin. "Wow, you really are a talented artist, you know that. All your practice paid off. I bet this girl actually isn't half as beautiful in real life as you make her out to be in your drawings. I mean, look at how good you made me appear. And this one?" She flipped the pages back until the first sketch came into view, the one of loose iblis looking like Pamela. It had been an illusion the other man had created, not a figment of Ben's own imagination, he knew now. What would Rochelle see when she looked at it? She was frowning, like she did when she looked at some of the pictures he'd drawn of her in the cafe. That wasn't good. "I've seen this before. Were you drawing a person posing to look like the statue, or the statue itself?" "The statue was amazing work, I've never seen anything quite like it. I'm not surprised you sketched it." She reached for her phone, then swiped across the screen several times before she held it out to him. "I did a whole series of posts about it when I was traveling. I had high hopes of becoming a travel blogger of sorts, until Jacob and Mum's illness summoned me home. Ah, here it is. A lonely line of cliffs, with nothing but ruins along them now, but in the middle of the fallen stones is this statue, guarded by 3 fierce-looking monsters. There are all sorts of stories that it's a grave and the White Lady's ghost walks the ruins looking for her lost love. That it's a gift from the Fae, for some favor no one seems to be able to say. Here, look." Ben didn't want to, but he could not refuse either. The white limestone he remembered had weathered to gray, giving the block of stone more shadows than it had cast on the day he carved it. Yet there she was, veiled and reaching for him, the same as the day he'd met her. A face he would never see again. Did you see the ghost with your own eyes? Ben asked. Perhaps if Pamela still haunted those ruins, he might be able to see her again. Rochelle gave a most unladylike snort. No, though I camped out in those ruins for a whole week, hoping I might. I heard plenty of howling, which the locals swore was a different ghost, the restless spirit of the last lord of the castle, but I'm sure it was just the wind. It's weird though. The statues, the girl and her gargoyle protectors, were in such good condition while the castle crumbled around them. Yet the stones looked identical. I looked, but I couldn't find any photos of what the castle looked like intact. That's because it never was. The castle those statues stood in was a folly, a fake ruin created for the knight who ruled those lands, a man with more money than sense. Until he gambled that away, or so I heard. From Pamela's own lips as she wept at the betrayal of her own father, who meant to sell her to settle his debts. He should have persuaded her to run away with him that very night. Then she might not have died. No, that's not true. There was a castle. The men in the tavern were very insistent about it, for the last lord burned it when he took his own life. Rochelle took the phone from him, swiped at it, then handed it back. There. They say he burned himself alive in that tower. Even burned and half collapsed, Ben would recognize Burke Castle anywhere. It wasn't really a castle. Just a tower, which is why he wanted the ruin built that looked like a much larger castle had once stood there. The tower was Burke Castle, but the ruined stone walls where the statues are? That's Burke's folly. Well, that's not the story they tell in the village pub. There they say the Lord went mad when his daughter died. That they caught the murderers, but the Lord kept insisting they'd got the wrong man and the real murderer was in London free as a bird, and he meant to catch him himself. Then he disappeared for a while, likely headed down to London they said, and when he returned he'd changed his tune. Now he kept saying the bird had been killed, butchered like he deserved, but justice still needed to be served. The innkeeper and his men tried to stop him, but the Lord was having none of it. He took 2 bottles of their best brandy and rode home. When the sun rose, the Lord's castle was a burning inferno, and they later found his body among the ashes. Only thing was, there were 2 heads. They ended up burying both in the same coffin, because they didn't know which one was his. I'm sure I wrote his name down somewhere. Sir William Burke. Not a lord at all, only a foolish knight who gambled too much. Ben wondered whose head the other one had been. I hope the other head belonged to Brandon, and that he did get what he deserved. Brandon? No, the Lord's name was Burke, I'm sure of it because it was so close to my own last name. Well, different spelling but still. I was curious. There might have been a family connection. Ben shook his head. Trust me, you did not want to claim any kind of relationship with Sir William Burke. He sold his daughter to a London moneylender, a man named Brandon, and he's the one who killed her, or that's what I heard. Rochelle stared at him for a long moment. You're from Scotland. You actually know this story. Not just the dramatic version they sell to tourists, but what really happened. Did you live near there? For a time. But it was a family tale. We were not family to the Burkes, of course, for my family were mostly farmers and tradesmen. No, it was the men convicted of the murder they did not commit, the Stone brothers transported here. A good place to make a new life, also they say. The convicts you wanted me to look up. That was them? And that's why you came here after you were released. Because if your ancestors could make a new life here, then maybe you could too. My God, Ben, that's horrible. History repeating itself when it should never have happened the first time. I can't believe. Can you find out what happened to Brandon? The moneylender? Ben asked. Her sympathy was sweet indeed, but he needed to know. If Burke had indeed sought justice for poor Pamela, then at least Ben could rest easy on her account. Well, I could look, but I'd probably need the computer instead of just my phone. Reluctantly, she climbed out of his lap and seated herself before the screen. 15 minutes later, she had her answer. George Brandon, notorious London crime boss in Georgian and early Victorian times. He owned brothels and gaming hells from London to Brighton, and was said to be rich enough to buy all the royal holdings in Britain, or so he said to his debtors before he fleeced them for all they were worth. He claimed to be the bastard son of a prince and an earl's wife, though there was no evidence he had such parentage. He disappeared mysteriously in 1851, when a gruesomely dismembered headless corpse was found in his office above one of his many brothels. Some say the body was his, and that the whores had banded together to butcher him like Julius Caesar, for being such a tyrant. Others say he escaped to the Americas, where he was killed in a slave rebellion, by his own slaves. Ben closed his eyes. So, either Burke killed him or Brandon had died at the hand of a woman. Both fitting fates for the bastard. Maybe Luce Iblis had been right, and Pamela truly was at peace, in the sort of afterlife such a gentle lady deserved. What year did Burke Castle burn? Ben asked. Also 1851. He dared to breathe again. William Burke had been a fool, but he'd loved his daughter enough to do the right thing in the end. His heart felt light as air. He wanted to fly. Or better yet. He swung Rochelle into his arms and kissed her soundly. One thing led to another, and he soon had his head buried between her thighs, until she was dripping wet with need for him as she begged for more than just his tongue. But she did not beg for long. No, Rochelle meant to be mistress of her own pleasure, he found, as she rolled with him until she sat atop him, inching her way along his body until she met the hardness she sought. She gave a little moan of pleasure as she impaled herself on him, before she began to move. Ben could not resist the siren call of her body, especially not when she squeezed him like that, as he labored long into the night, to give this woman he loved everything she asked for, and more. 53. Ben spent his days at school and his nights were Rochelle's. He'd started work on the painting, holed up in a spacious section between the roof and ceiling in the school's administration building, and he began to hope she might like the finished result. If she did not, he would keep it for himself, and when he was alone he might feast his eyes upon her, fist himself in his hand and… Ugh! Not when he was holding a tube of paint. Now he'd need to buy more ultramarine. If this was what Dunstan had felt for Kara, after tumbling with her just the once, no wonder he had been so miserable when she'd married another man. Another man she'd tumbled daily for months, mind you, squealing like a stuck pig all the while. Now if Rochelle were to leave him for another man, a real man, not some monster made out of living stone who could not set foot in daylight. A man who didn't have a century-old vendetta to pursue. Ben shuddered at the thought. But he called me a fairy, sir. Fae were monsters for sure, though he hadn't heard of any here. Perhaps the creatures had followed the colonists from Scotland. But the boy sitting in the office below with the school counselor looked as human as any of the other students. Gradually, as the boy and his counselor conversed, Ben began to understand the situation better. It was legal to be a Molly now, not a crime, but there were those who still made Molly's lives miserable for liking men more than women. Ben might not learn as much about the world as he might if he lurked above a classroom, but he learned plenty about the people of this time and their troubles. For all the differences, some things still stayed the same. When evening came, he strolled down High Street to the cafe. The cafe was empty, so instead of setting up in the corner where he'd spend the evening closer to strangers than he was to Rochelle, he marched up to the counter to greet her with a kiss. "I'm happy to see you too," she said. "Do you want me to make you a coffee or something before you start work?" If he'd had any need of sustenance, he'd have eagerly accepted her offer. The smell of her coffee or any one of the cakes was enough to tempt him. So he pretended to stare at the menu on the counter for a moment before he shook his head. "I'm fine." Then a strange picture caught his eye on the television screen behind the counter. Normally he never looked at it, as it wasn't visible from the table where he sat to work, but now he could see the strangest thing. "What is that?" He pointed. Rochelle glanced over her shoulder. "Oh, that's the Mothman dancing on the roof of the building over the road. We've been playing this video and the other one on repeat since I filmed them, seeing as they went viral and all. We're still offering a month's worth of free coffee to anyone who can capture another picture of the creature, but he only seems to come out when I'm around." Ben watched the video. A winged man danced jerkily across the rooftop, before the video ended and the screen showed the footpath below. In the darkness under the veranda, a cloaked figure lurked. A woman ran into the figure's arms, before they both disappeared. Then the dancing man was back. "Have you seen him?" Rochelle asked. Actually, if he looked closely enough, it could have been him. The wings, the horns, except Ben had never in his life danced like that, and he certainly did not go around kidnapping women. Especially not with his wings out. Whoever these men were or had been, they were foolish indeed to allow someone to photograph them so publicly. This world liked to hunt monsters instead of sensibly avoiding them, like they'd been doing for centuries in Scotland. "I have not, but I can tell you that he is no moth," Ben said. "That is a gargoyle. 2, if I am not mistaken, for the one on the roof is much thinner than the one on the footpath." Rochelle laughed. "You mean those grotesque monster things they stick on the edge of churches, like drainpipes?" Probably a good thing he hadn't told her he was one then. Not if she'd only laugh at him, if she even believed him. "Gargoyles have many purposes, the most important of which is protection," Ben said. "Well, the girls who live there could probably do with a bit of protection. Maybe that's why they put that little gargoyle statue up on the roof." "What?" Rochelle led him over to the window, then pointed upward. "See that section of scrollwork on top of the round pediment? There's a little plinth up there, and on top of it is a fat little gargoyle with stubby wings. It doesn't look a thing like my Mothman though." Ben's eyes drifted down from the gargoyle statue to the well-lit upstairs windows. The ones that had been dark the last time he looked at the building. "Someone's there," he said. Rochelle shrugged. "Well, yes. There are 2 apartments above the shops. One of them is owned by a lovely lady who comes in for muffins all the time. I don't know who lives in the other one. Someone who doesn't like my coffee, I guess." Could it be the butcher? Still there after all this time? For only a truly evil person could possibly hate Rochelle's coffee or any of the cafe's offerings, which were all made with so much love. Gargoyles guarded the building. Gargoyles just like him. The butcher wouldn't have left the guards behind if he wasn't still using the place, surely. Tonight, once Rochelle had had her fill of him, he'd sneak over the road and investigate. After all, it couldn't hurt to check, right? 54. Rochelle sighed, curling up to his side. Ben would have given every cent he owned to roll her onto her back, and bury himself back inside her until morning. Better yet, to never have to leave her at all. But he owed a duty to his brother's memory, and he could not delay that for his own selfish desires any longer. Besides, if he left now, he might be able to return before dawn, to claim a kiss from the half-asleep lass before he departed for the day. He slipped inside the walls of the new building, the limestone parting for him like water. Floor by floor he searched, but he found no secrets. Well, he found 2 randy couples who were as wild in their lovemaking as himself and Rochelle, but he had no desire to waste time watching. If it was lovemaking he wanted, he knew where Rochelle waited. It wasn't until he reached the cellars that he noticed something different. The stones here were older, not as smoothly cut. As though this cellar had been built long before the house above. Perhaps. Down he went, gliding through concrete and flagstones until he found a second cellar beneath the first. A small chamber, this one, so filled with dust and cobwebs it was hard to see anything in the darkness. He stumbled about, banging into things until he touched the stub of a candle, melted into a niche on the wall alongside a box of matches. Within moments he had light enough to see by, but he did not believe his eyes. This was Pierce's secret cellar, exactly as he remembered it. Why, when he wiped away the cobwebs, he found the dusty lumps on the table to be the teapot and cups Pierce had used to drug them, and likely other unsuspecting men, if Rochelle had indeed seen two gargoyles just like him. His brothers' bodies were gone, with no tracks in the dust to tell him where or how or even when they had been taken. Long ago most likely, for the thick carpet of dust on the floor showed only Ben's own footprints. But the boxes that had glittered and almost glowed in the candlelight that night, filled with unimaginable riches, those were still here. Hardly daring to breathe, Ben reached out to brush a century's worth of dust away from the nearest box. Gold glimmered beneath his hand, just as it had then. Like a mad maid, he began to dust the room, clearing the dirt away to reveal a fortune beyond his wildest dreams. Than any sane man's wildest dreams. Enough to buy a grand house where he and Rochelle might live, with enough left over that he might study art while she did whatever she wished, without ever having to make another coffee or listen to a man complain for half an hour about how a muffin had more or less nuts than the one beside it. He could pay someone to make coffee and muffins for her. He pulled out a chair and half fell into it, his thoughts here, there, and everywhere. His brothers were not here. The gold was. Which meant the butcher could not be far. But surely not close enough to stop Ben from taking a box of the stuff for himself. After all, the butcher had stolen it. Surely in all the years that had passed, people had given up looking for it. No one would appear to arrest him after all this time. Then again, why had the butcher not touched any of it? Did he know of dangers that Ben did not? The internet was a wondrous thing, filled with more information than any man could understand. Perhaps today's police had not forgotten about the theft, and they could catch him faster than the ones who'd arrested him in his own time. Then there were the gargoyles too. They must be guarding the gold in the butcher's absence. Ben would take his chances against most men, but two gargoyles as indestructible as himself? The odds would not be in his favor, the risk was too high. Ben sighed. He dare not take any of the gold. Not yet, anyway. He needed to find the butcher and force him to turn Ben back into a man, so that he could be with Rochelle. No, he needed to find out how to make the change himself, so that he might transform not only himself but the other gargoyles back into normal men. Then he needed to kill the butcher, as justice for his brothers. Then and only then could he claim the gold. So that he might live free and build a new life with Rochelle, if she would have him. Ben blew out a breath. Yes. That's what he would do. He'd. A scream rent the air on the street above. He could feel Rochelle's panic. Something was wrong. Heedless of the gold or anything else in the secret cellar, Ben shot up to the surface. 55. How dare you cancel me? You're nobody. Ben expected to find Rochelle screaming or at the very least, a woman, but instead it was a man throwing a monumental tantrum in the middle of the road. Well, a boy really, for no self-respecting man would behave like a toddler, surely. Oh, but it was Rochelle's former roommate. What was his name again? Jacob, that was it. Show yourself, Rochelle. I know you're in there, and if you won't come out, I'll have to come in and drag you out, back home where you belong. Ben shifted into the shadows, where the darkness might hide his true form. Horns, wings and all, for the moment he'd threatened Rochelle, he'd summoned the monster. A monster who would allow no one to hurt her, ever again. Best he deal with this quickly, before Rochelle woke up and saw him. Or perhaps she'd just believe he was the Mothman she'd filmed in the past. Maybe she'd even film him dealing with Jacob, and post that upon her video channel, attracting a new horde of customers to the cafe to hunt the monster. A monster who would happily draw their likeness for a fee while they drank their coffee and waited for a glimpse of what they did not understand. What is it, Jakob? Is this about the restraining order? Too late. The upstairs window flew open and it framed Rochelle, hastily wrapped in a robe to hide her nakedness. The court agreed to issue it this week, so I imagine if you've received it by now, you understand that you're not allowed to be this close to me, or the police will arrest you. Go home, Jakob. She raised her arms to close the window. Don't you walk away from me. You're nobody, he screamed. You can't cancel me like this. Canceling my internet will not stop the signal. I will be heard or my fans will destroy you. I cancelled my internet. If you want internet access so much, you can pay for it. Goodbye, Jakob. You're just jealous. Jealous because I'm a successful star and you're nobody. You're so useless at filming, even the university staff can see it. Failing every assignment, failing at life. You're just embarrassing yourself, trying to be me when you'll never be good enough. Never. Actually, I passed my last 2 assignments. I might end up getting my degree after all, no thanks to you. Everything you are is thanks to me. Everything. You're no one without me and I'll show you. I'll show everyone. Whatever, Jakob. Down came the window and Rochelle disappeared from view. Ben took a step forward out of the shadows. He intended to see this idiot as far away from Rochelle as possible. Perhaps he'd fly him out to sea and drop him in. What's the matter, son? 2 police officers appeared on the footpath, scant meters from Ben. Ben ducked out of sight. That crazy bitch is trying to drive me out of my home, cancelling my show. Jakob flailed an arm in the vague direction of Rochelle's window. She'd closed the window but Ben could still see her up there, pacing worriedly in the shadows. She might have sounded calm and dismissive, but she was anything but. Move along, son, you're causing a disturbance. If you don't move on, we'll be forced to arrest you, and we don't want that, do we? It's her you should arrest. She's crazy. Stealing my home, my show, sullying my good name with trumped-up charges that aren't true. His voice rose to a shriek. Maybe that's so, but that's no reason to make a fuss. We need to keep the peace, and you're definitely disturbing it. Last chance, son. Will you move along, or do we need to take your details and take you down to the station? It was the wrong thing to say. The idiot reared up, his voice rising up into a scream again. Don't you know who I am? Don't you? I'm Jakob Tolik, Iago to my fans, and to them I am a god. The cops exchanged glances as one of them noted down Jakob's details. Isn't that the guy who escaped from prison a few weeks back? The one we delivered a temporary restraining order to yesterday? Better bring him in. Especially if he's in violation of the order already. To Ben's delight, they handcuffed Jakob and started to lead him back to the station. You'll be sorry. You can't cancel me. I'll go back to my parents' place and use their satellite link. I'll show everybody what a loser you are, what a failure you've always been, and you'll be sorry. You're nobody. 56. You're nobody. Jakob's shouts echoed around the room, even with the window shut. Rochelle fell to her knees, her eyes too blurred by tears to see anymore. He was right, of course. She was nobody. Even Ben hadn't bothered to stay, he'd gotten what he came for, and left the moment she was asleep. Are you all right? The voice was Ben's, a deep purr that had always made her feel better. Not tonight, though. Nothing could do that. Where were you? When she'd needed him. I was outside, debating whether to knock that idiot on the head and bury him in an early grave, or to drag him back to his house and stick his head in the toilet, to give him a taste of his own shit. Rochelle almost giggled at that. He couldn't be serious. Ben moved closer. I had hoped to get rid of him one way or another before he woke you up, but I failed spectacularly. The police stole my thunder, and I suspect he's going to be spending a very uncomfortable night in their cells, while you enjoy some well-deserved peace and quiet. Probably for the best. She sighed. If she had any sense, or if she wasn't feeling like a wrung-out dish rag right now, she'd summon the last of her courage and tell him to go home. Not to waste his time on someone like her. I wouldn't have wanted you getting arrested for a nobody like me. You're not nobody. It sounded sweet, and maybe he even believed it, but that didn't make it true. He's right. I am nobody. I'm a talentless nobody who's failed more university units than I've passed, to the point where they're probably going to kick me out and never let me graduate. Jakob has a successful video channel with thousands of fans who watch every video he posts, and here I am, living in the attic above the coffee shop where I spend every day serving coffee and muffins, smiling until my face aches, at whingers who want to complain just to hear the sound of their own voice. Ben's arms wrapped around her and hauled her to her feet. You're not nobody. You're Rochelle Burke. You make the best coffee and muffins in Fremantle, and the whingers all come here because you're the best listener, with the most beautiful smile, and you're kind enough to actually listen instead of telling them to go away. You've taken a struggling cafe, and your viral marketing videos have turned it into a thriving business. In fact, your 2 Mothman videos have more views than every video on Jakob's channel combined. Rochelle shook her head. That's not true. He has fans. Actual fans who watch every week. I just posted 2 short, blurry videos I took on my phone. They can't possibly. Ben pulled out his phone and showed her. Thousands and millions. There was a whole extra 0 on the Shut Up channel than there was on Jakob's. Shit. But just because more people liked the Mothman than Jakob's gaming videos, didn't change anything. I'm still nobody. No, you're not. You're the sweetest, kindest, most beautiful woman I've ever met. You're so amazing in bed, you're all I can think about. All I can draw since the moment I first kissed you. You're bewitching. One smile from you and all I can think about is what I can do to make you smile again. Sure, maybe there are a lot of things you haven't done yet. You're young. You have time to do everything, then change your life and do everything again differently. You've made an ex-convict believe in happy ever after again. Because you can build a new life, no matter how bad things get. You're the mistress of your own destiny. You're also the woman I love. Rochelle swallowed. Had he truly said that? You're the woman I love, and I think it's time I showed you how much I love you, until you forget any of this ever happened. She managed a watery smile. That's pretty hard. He lifted her in his arms and carried her to the bed. Well, pretty hard is my specialty, especially when I'm naked with you. What do you say to allowing me to worship your body, like the goddess you are? She had to laugh at that. What woman could say no to that? Nobody, she thought she heard him say, but then his lips were on hers and his hands were stroking her, and there was nobody else in the world who mattered but her and Ben. 57. When Ben arrived at the cafe the following evening, he was surprised to see Tacy at the counter and not Rochelle. She's at the prison tonight, she reminded him. Ah, yes, of course. I'm sure she'd love it if you joined one of her tours. Go on, take the night off. I'll tell anyone who asks for you that you'll be back tomorrow, Tacy urged. If Ben didn't know better, he'd think Tacy was trying to matchmake him with Rochelle. Little did she know that Rochelle already owned him, body and soul. He bowed. Thank you, I will. But instead of heading up High Street toward the prison, he crossed the road, to stand before the house whose shadows had hidden him last night. Below him was the butcher's gold, and somewhere behind the windows that glowed with warmth were the answers he sought. He took to the walls, searching for the house's inhabitants. He found all of them in a dining room together, having dinner. Ben burst out of the wall, spreading his wings wide so as to look as frightening as possible. "Where is William Pierce?" he roared. The blonde woman shrugged. "Who?" She stabbed something with a fork and lifted it to her lips as if nothing was amiss. "William Pierce, the butcher." The men rose slowly from their seats, as if they'd finally decided he was a threat. The one who'd been sitting next to the blonde sprouted wings just like Ben's. "There's no one here by that name, so you'd best be on your way, friend." Something warm and furry rubbed against Ben's ankle. He glanced down to find a small black cat twining herself with great determination around his legs. Purring for heaven's sake. "I will not leave until you tell me where William Pierce is. I have business with him that will not wait a moment longer." The dark-haired girl pulled out her phone. "Well, I can look him up and see if he has a social media profile. Maybe you can message him. Now how do you spell Pierce?" This was not going at all how Ben had hoped. Damn it, where is Pierce? That was surely one of Pierce's gargoyles, so he had to know where he was. Yet it was the other man who spoke. "You know, I think I do remember a Pierce. I think he was a butcher. But it was so long ago, he's probably dead now." He twirled his fork into a mess of noodles, then lifted it to his mouth. The gargoyle looked longingly at the other man's dinner. "Probably," he agreed. Emro. The creature had clawed its way up Ben's pants and now clung to his shirt, butting his hand. "What is wrong with your cat?" he demanded, patting the creature. The blonde woman blinked. "Oh, Lucky likes gargoyles. Really likes gargoyles. She'll follow you around the walls, waiting for you to pop out, so she can rub up against you. I thought we had rats at first. Gargoyles are so much better." She laced her fingers with the gargoyles and squeezed like they were a couple. Ben sighed. So much for threatening them into giving him what he wanted. He tucked his wings away and reshaped himself into the unassuming form Rochelle knew best. The man's fork clattered to the floor. He jumped up from the table, his face whiter than the moon. "Ben," he whispered. "We thought you were dead." The blonde woman stared at him avidly. "The prison records say you're dead, but evidently they made a mistake." "Interesting." She sipped from her water glass. The gargoyle folded his wings away and squinted at Ben. "Ben?" Ben blinked. At first he hadn't recognized them, but now he could see the two men side by side, sans horns. "Tor. Dunstan? You're alive?" The blonde woman rose, collecting the plates. "Right, I guess dinner's over then. Get the brotherly reunion hugs out of the way, because we're going to go the lounge room next, where we're all going to sit down and you," she pointed at Ben, "are going to tell us everything. Or I'll set the cat on you." Whoever she was, this was not a woman to cross. "Yes ma'am," Ben said. "Anemone, please. I've only just broken your brother of his bad habit of calling me his lady all the time." "Yes ma, Anemone." She tried not to laugh. "You'll do." 58. Only Pierce could have possibly completed the spell and woken me up, so he has to be alive, Ben finished. "I'm sorry, I have no idea," Anemone said. She turned her laptop so Ben could see the screen. "I've looked, but all I can find is that he disappeared about the same time as the records say you died. He certainly didn't wake Tor or Dunstan. That was Katina and I, or that's what we believed." Nods all around. "Then how did you break the curse if Pierce didn't do it?" Ben asked Tor. Both Tor and Katina turned red. Tor coughed. "Well, we thought it was because we had sex, but..." That didn't work for us, Anemone said, rubbing her belly. So breaking the curse might be more complicated than we thought, Katina began, tearing her eyes away from Anemone. My friend Callie says the only way to break the curse is to melt a heart of stone. She has an old spell book with a ritual we think might have been used to turn people into gargoyles. It certainly sounds like what you remember, Ben, so it makes sense that the rest of what it says is also true. Perhaps Callie might know more. There might be alternative translations that give us more information, so that we can help you and Dunstan break the curse on both of you too. I mean, I know the wings and horns are handy, but you have to miss sunlight. And food, Dunstan added. All right, so we should go see this Callie. But first we should probably bring up the gold, because only gargoyles can get to it. All four faces turned to stare at him. What gold? 15 minutes later, he stood in the hidden cellar with Dunstan, each of them armed with Anemone's high-powered torches. Katina had offered her phone so Ben could take pictures, but he told her he had his own. At her look of disbelief, he'd been forced to pull it out and tell her he used it to access the internet, and so that clients could contact him during the day. She still hadn't looked convinced, but she was as eager to find out about this gold as the rest of them, so she let it go. Dunstan stared around him in wonder, as if he'd never been in this room before. That's where he put your body. Ben pointed. Tor was over there. I remember waking up in the dark, rising up through stone and then, Anemone, Dunstan said slowly. But I don't ever remember seeing this. What else do you remember? Ben asked, curious. Dunstan shrugged. Not much of anything really before I woke up. There's a faint memory of you, more your name than anything, and Kara, which is a whole world of hurt. Ben nodded. Well, you did tumble a pregnant woman who was engaged to marry another man. I don't know how you thought that could ever end well. Dunstan just shook his head. I don't remember any of that. I only remember her sending me away. Most strange. Ben had no problems remembering everything, except the time he was asleep. What made Dunstan different? Did Tor lose his memories too? If he hadn't, then perhaps the butcher had botched the spell on Dunstan. Yes. He didn't remember a thing until he and Katina broke the curse, he said. He didn't even remember he had brothers. At least I remembered you. He sounded pretty proud of that. Maybe he stuffed up the spell on me then, Ben mused. Actually, that could be true. The butcher hadn't finished the spell, so Ben had kept his memories, while his brothers had lost theirs, at least temporarily. Hopefully Dunstan would remember things when they lifted the curse. Where's the gold? Dunstan asked. Ben used the brush Anemone had given him to sweep the dust away from one shelf after the other. All in these boxes, he said. Dunstan's eyes widened. Wow. Wow indeed. Ben weighed one box in his hands, then began to count them. I estimate there's a little over 200 kilograms here. When Dunstan looked lost, Ben did a quick calculation in his head. Maybe just under 500 pounds? Dunstan nodded. We should probably get Tor to help. It will go faster then. To get Tor down here, we'd need to find a way in that doesn't involve walking through walls. There was a ladder over here somewhere. Ben scanned the room, searching for the spot. Ah, there it was, but it was so caked in what appeared to be dried mud, he hadn't recognized it at first. He scaled the ladder, only to find the way blocked at the top. There had been a hinge here before to lift the false privy seat to allow them to climb up, but either the hinges had corroded in place or someone had nailed the whole thing shut. There was nothing else for it. Ben bunched up his stone fist and punched his way through. He emerged into a closet of sorts, a privy, walled up so no one would find it. He battered his way through those boards too, and found himself in a cellar full of more modern furniture than that down below, but far more battered than anything he'd seen in Anemone's apartment. But there was an electric light in here, and a door that led through to the entrance hall. "You can come up, I think I've found the way out," he called down to Dunstan. "It might be better if you came down. I think I've found the butcher you were looking for, and he's in a bad way." After a quick examination of the body Dunstan had found, they returned to the others through the walls. At the mention of a skeleton, Katina refused to let anyone go down there again. "If there's a body, we'll need to call the police." Dunstan and Anemone looked worried. "I can't," he began. "Me neither," Ben said. When no one else said anything, he continued, "Look, we can wait a few days before we call them, can't we? I mean, as long as no one disturbs the cellar any more than we already have. I might be able to find somewhere that you can stay for a day or two, while the police investigate. Both of you." "Thank you," Anemone said. "I wish I could go and hide too, but the police already know me, so it's probably best that I stay to field any difficult questions. Katina's about to start her PhD on hidden objects in houses, so we'll say you were looking around our house, doing a little investigation of your own, and found the hidden chamber. You looked around, found the body, and then called the police. As soon as we can find somewhere for you boys to stay." "On it," Ben said. They all stared at him as though he'd said something wrong. Perhaps they'd misheard him. "I said I'm on it." Anemone smiled. "You're not like your brothers at all. Intriguing. All right then. Come visit again when you have an update for us, please." He'd been dismissed. That was fair. He'd interrupted their dinner after all, before he'd busted a hole in their cell. If he was them, he wouldn't invite him over for coffee and cake, either. He wished his brothers and their lovers good night, before he headed back out to the street. 59. The cafe was still open, and Tacy stood behind the counter, cleaning out the sandwich cabinets. Ben had expected Rochelle, but she was probably still at the prison. He should head over there so he could walk her home soon, but in the meantime, Tacy might be able to help him. "Can I ask a favor?" Tacy looked up. "You can ask. But if you want a sandwich, go ahead, take your pick." Ben shook his head. "I was wondering if you know where the university is." "Which one?" "There's 5 main ones plus some satellite campuses dotted around the place." "I don't know. Someone told me I need to go to the university to consult a Latin scholar named Callie." Tacy burst out laughing. "Oh, that would be Notre Dame University, just around the corner. But there's no need for you to go there. Callie is my housemate. I'll ask her to come by the cafe one night when you're working. She was intrigued to hear we had an artist in residence at the cafe. I'm sure she'd love to meet you." Ben thanked her, then checked the time. If he hurried, he'd get to the prison in time to walk Rochelle home. When he'd have to ask for an even bigger favor, if she knew somewhere he might be able to accommodate his brothers for a few days during the police investigation. 60. 1 chai latte with coconut milk, and do you have any muffins or friands with coconut in them to go with it? I think Tacy does a couple of them with raspberry or butterscotch. Rochelle looked up to find Callie at the counter. "You forgot the Lamington one." Callie laughed. Who could forget Tacy's twist on Lamingtons? But I know she only does those for special events like Australia Day, and they sell out pretty quick. At this time of the afternoon, I've got no chance. Well, it looks like there's 1 butterscotch muffin left if you want it. Oh hell yes. Rochelle rang up the order, then began to make it. So, which one is your artist in residence? Callie asked in a loud whisper. Rochelle didn't need to look up to check. Ben won't be here until after sunset. Something about the light. But when he does arrive, that table is reserved for him. She pointed to the corner where the wall was now covered in his sketches. Then that's where I'll sit to wait for him. Rochelle had to swallow down the lump in her throat as Callie took Ben's usual seat, sipping her chai completely oblivious to the position she'd usurped. But she was Tacy's friend and moreover Tacy's roommate, and Tacy would not be pleased if Callie complained about one of her employees being rude to her, like Rochelle wanted to be. Then a large group of customers came in, all wanting complicated hot drinks to accompany heated-up muffins and brownies, topped with Tacy's new brandy sauce and custard. By the time she'd delivered their entire order, Ben and Callie were so deep in conversation, he barely noticed her. She sighed. He'd been really quiet on the walk home last night, lost in thought that she hadn't wanted to pry. Yet he'd just met Callie, and now he was talking as though they'd known each other forever. Rochelle had never been a jealous person before, and she wasn't sure she was one now, but it hurt to think the one man she'd begun to care about didn't trust her enough to confide in her. Maybe he'd tell her everything later. When they weren't in a crowded cafe full of people clamoring for more brandy sauce. She sighed, collected up the empty cups and took them back to the kitchen to make sure they were washed. 61. I'm Callie. The pixie-like girl stuck her hand out, her eyes appearing huge beneath her cap of dark hair. Ben shook her hand. He would never get used to this modern habit, no matter how many times he did it. Ben Stone. The unusually handsome artist in residence at the Shut-Up Cafe, and Rochelle's new ride if the rumors are to be believed. She winked. Ben had learned a lot of modern figures of speech, but this one eluded him. I'm sorry, I don't understand, he said. This only widened her smile. Ooh, a gentleman. Goddess knows she deserves one after that gaming asshole. And she keeps looking over here like she thinks I intend to steal you. Well, you make sure you tell her I wish you both the best together. But you didn't invite me here for my blessing, unless you wanted it done in Latin. Tacy said you were interested in gargoyles. Ben nodded and leaned forward so his words wouldn't carry to the rest of the cafe. I was talking to Katina and she mentioned you had some sort of spell book that said how to turn people into gargoyles. Callie folded her hands on the table. It also says how to summon demons, make a man perish of lust, and ward a house from evil spirits, but there's no evidence to prove any of these things are even possible, let alone that the instructions in this book would result in the desired outcome, even if it was. And if you even think of casting any of these spells on Rochelle or anyone else I know, I must inform you that I know some particularly nasty curses and I will cast every single one of them on you. Emphasized with a sharp nod. She was a witch, Ben guessed, and she was testing him before sharing her knowledge. What kind of curses? He asked. I will curse your phone so that all the text appears in ancient Greek. I will curse your nostrils so that you will smell nothing but ammonia for a week. And I will poison the minds of any woman who thinks to bed you, so that they believe you are infected with a deadly strain of genital herpes. Ben relaxed. None of her curses relied upon magic at all, though he didn't doubt she could perform them. He'd managed the ammonia one himself, and had no desire to do it again. I wouldn't mind brushing up on my ancient Greek. I did have a classical education, but I admit I have forgotten much of my Greek and Latin. But Katina told me you were fluent in both Latin and Viking runes. Callie sighed. You're an arcane history buff like Katina, aren't you? All right, I brought scans of the book and my translations. They're all on my laptop. In the meantime, I'll give you the short version I gave Katina. It was not short, but it was fascinating. It also made Ben shudder, for it took a most peculiar kind of person to kill someone, then cut up their cooling corpse, perform a bizarre ritual and bury them before building their home on top of the grave. This book Callie now possessed might once have belonged to the butcher, for surely there could not have been two such evil people in such a small colony. Ben tapped the screen. So what do you think this means? You've translated it as melting a heart of stone, and that's what Katina told me, but that's an alchemy term that refers to a transformation into something else, a complex process that is nowhere near as simple as melting. Callie appeared impressed. I've never met a man quite so interested in arcane history, well, who wasn't a complete nutter who believed magic and witchcraft and spells were real. There's still a few of them around. Ben ducked his head. He wished he didn't believe spells were real, but he was living proof that this spell worked. Now all he needed was to make it stop working and he could go back to believing the world made sense again. It's just a hobby and a purely theoretical discussion, he assured her. But what do you think the writer meant by this? Katina said it was just about sex. That sex could melt a heart and undo the spell, but I don't agree. Surely it can't be so simple. Callie nodded. I agree. I mean, we're talking love and lust for a start. Sex is the objective of lust, while love is more about the heart. There are many kinds of love, not all of which involve sex. And for most people, sex isn't exactly transformative. Well, unless you're talking about the power of the magic pussy. Ben felt his cheeks grow hot. No. He hadn't known it was possible to enchant that part of a woman's anatomy, and while he couldn't deny that good sex might appear magical, surely it wasn't because. Yeah, it only happens in romance books, sadly. Not real life. Anyway, there could be any number of things that they considered transformational. Traditionally, only enemies are used as foundation sacrifices, so perhaps the transformation is more in the head than the heart, because you'd need to seriously change your thinking for the kind of paradigm shift that turns an enemy into a friend, or even a lover. She coughed. Which brings us to sex again. You know, if you haven't done it with Rochelle yet, you should really do something about the unresolved romantic tension between the two of you, because I swear I can feel the heat from here and she's not even looking at me. Whatever your secret is, just man up and tell her already, so you can get to the passionate sex part. She really looks like she needs. Callie gulped, then pasted a big smile on her face. Hi Rochelle. Are you coming to the girls' night Tacy has planned for next week? It'll be at Alethea's place so as not to wake up Rory, like we did last time. Rochelle shook her head. I'll be working, either here or at the prison. You all have fun though. Is there anything else I can get you? Another muffin, maybe? She looked from Ben to Callie, but they both shook their heads. All right, just let me know if you change your mind. She collected Callie's empty cup and plate and left. Please tell me you're not going to leave her hanging, Callie said. Ben stiffened. I assure you my attentions toward Rochelle are purely honorable. Yeah. She could do with a bit of honorable after the last bloke, but I'm just saying you should make sure it comes with a big side order of dick. Good dick. Ben wasn't sure what to say to that. In all his years, no one had ever questioned the goodness of his penis. Finally, he just nodded. That seemed to satisfy the strange woman. Well, what else did you want to know about foundation sacrifices? Except that they sound seriously gross and twisted, and anyone who does them has some serious issues? Like Pierce. Ben shuddered. Yeah, cutting into bodies like that would take a decidedly twisted mind. I can understand why they'd choose to do it to their enemies. I couldn't imagine doing something like that to the bodies of your family or friends, or anyone you cared about. Callie did not look pleased. Please tell me you are not going to try to make a gargoyle, or I swear to you, I will make good on those curses, only I'll swap out the Greek for kanji and then you'll be sorry. Ben raised his hands in surrender. I have no intention of sacrificing anyone. But I have seen where it was done. Once. It was not pretty. It still wasn't, and he needed to find somewhere for his brothers to stay so the police might begin their investigation. Well, it's been fun, but it's my turn to cook tonight, so I should be going. Now, Mr. Honorable, will you at least promise to kiss Rochelle tonight? He inclined his head. "That I will certainly promise." 62. The following day, ensconced in his secret art studio in the school ceiling, Ben couldn't seem to concentrate. All he could think about was how he could possibly be there. From what he'd understood from Callie and her spellbook, the ritual had involved giving them a combination of herbs in a drugged tea. Like a form of modern anesthetic, he presumed, prior to surgery that was more like butchery, which is likely why Pierce had not had any qualms performing the ritual. According to Callie's book, the witch, for want of a better word, cut out the sacrifice's heart, then replaced it with stone, thus turning them into a paranormal protector made of living stone. But in order for the sacrifice to be summoned later to actually perform his protection duties, his body had to be laid to rest beneath the land he was to protect, and a stone laid atop his grave. There, the sacrifice slumbered until they were called into service. Summoning the sacrifice involved removing the stone on top of the grave, and actually calling for them to help. His brothers, laid to rest in the secret cellar with a road and a building on top, were proper protectors, until the removal of the road above had awoken them. Katina's call for help had summoned Tor to her aid, and Anemone's desperate cry for assistance, some days later, had brought Dunstan out of hiding. As gargoyles, neither man had much memory of their past. They knew only what it was to be a gargoyle, and this compelled them to serve their respective mistresses or charges. Ben wasn't sure exactly how that part worked. He, on the other hand, had drunk the tea and possibly had his heart cut out, or partially so. The butcher must have managed to get the stone into his chest too, or he would simply have died of his wounds, and that was that. The guards who'd found him in the road had thought he'd died of his wounds when they buried him. Not knowing about the ritual, their main concern was seeing that he had a decent burial, even if it was in a pauper's grave. He'd had no stone laid above him, so the ritual had remained unfinished. Ben had been as good as dead. But someone, somehow, had finished the ritual. They'd laid and removed the stone, leaving no trace of it when Ben reached the grassy surface of the school sports field. Nor had he seen any sign of his summoner, who surely should have been there. Unless they'd somehow been driven away before Ben had dug his way out of the grave. No one called for help unless they actually needed it, so perhaps the summoner had been in such great need, such great fear, that waking Ben had been a desperate act, too late to do much good, for mortal danger was already upon them. Pierce the butcher was the most logical person. He'd performed the ritual in fear of his life and theft of his gold, so it made sense that he would have summoned Ben to protect him. Unless the skeleton in the cellar truly was the butcher. In which case, he'd likely have fallen down the ladder after Ben kicked him in his desperation to escape, killing the man. Which would make Ben a killer, if only in self-defense. Yet another reason for him to avoid the police investigation of the cellar. He had no desire to go back to prison, and he did not fancy trying to explain to them how he'd managed to murder a man over 100 years ago. If the skeleton did belong to the butcher, then it would take some serious arcane power for him to finish the spell and wake Ben. For a ghost or a shade surely couldn't lift a stone large enough to cover a man's body. If the butcher still lived, then he still possessed unusual magical powers, allowing him to prolong his life for so long. Well, if he'd been human in the first place. If there were gargoyles and creatures like Luce Iblis in the world, then it made sense that other monsters might be walking among them, capable of all manner of remarkable things. A man who could live forever could easily have strolled up to Ben's grave with a piece of stone, finished the ritual, and then summoned Ben as his protector. But if he had, why now, and why had he disappeared if he'd needed Ben so much? Neither scenario made a lick of sense. There was also a third option. The spellbook had perhaps passed from Pierce to someone else, or he'd borrowed it in the first place and been forced to return it. The book's true owner then had to be a powerful witch, capable of completing the spell Pierce had not. The first and most obvious candidate was Callie. She was, after all, the present owner of the spellbook, and she was capable of both understanding and translating it. Except, Callie did not believe in magic. He recognized her skepticism, for it matched what his own beliefs had been, before he'd become the victim of a spell. She was forthright too in her unflinching talk of sex. If she'd believed in magic, she would have said so. Also, she'd been horrified that he'd seen a Foundation sacrifice, which meant she evidently had never seen such a thing, outside of her spell book's description of it. The second candidate was Rochelle. Sweet and kind and everything his heart could want, but he'd also seen her pretend to be a convicted killer in the prison. Rochelle was a capable actress, capable of fooling even him if she so wished. She was also the person who'd benefited most from his awakening. He'd lost count of the number of times he'd acted as her protector, and even now, he still felt the strong urge to keep protecting her. Could it be the same as the compulsion his brothers had described? Except, neither Katina or Anemone had actually cast the spell in the first place. They had both simply asked for help at the right moment, and his brothers had answered their call. Perhaps Rochelle had merely called to him at the precise moment the spell had been completed, stealing him from the butcher or the witch who wanted to use him for their own nefarious purposes. Which meant the witch was likely still out there somewhere, and a danger to both him and Rochelle. Ben shook his head, but it didn't help the roiling headache building at so many twisting possibilities. The most sensible thing to do would be to forget the witch, and try to break the curse. Then they'd have no hold over him. If only he knew how to melt or transmute a heart of stone. Finding the mysterious witch, or, if he still lived, the butcher, sounded much easier. More satisfying too. Ben nodded to himself and returned to his painting. It would be ready for her within the week. 63. Was that her phone? Rochelle swore and tugged off her headphones. She was trying to finish editing her latest assignment, and she had to get the timing just right for the beats of this rapid montage. Yep, that was her phone all right, and it was her father calling. Finally. It had been weeks since she'd last heard from him. He must have finished mustering and returned to the homestead. "Hi Dad," she said, plugging her headphones into the charger. This would likely be a long call. "How'd the mustering go? Did you get enough hands to help?" She'd helped out a few times when Mum was still alive, but between uni and Jakob, she hadn't been back since. Listening to her dad's stories about this year's muster was almost like going home. Even with the borders closed, they had enough first-timers to make life interesting, and she was soon laughing and wishing she'd headed north when she left Jakob, instead of staying in Fremantle. But that would have meant giving up on any chance of graduating, which she wouldn't do, not while there was still hope. Her grades from this semester would either dash those hopes or see them right again for at least another semester. When her father finally finished describing the Gillaroos' response when she'd realized donkey showers weren't powered by an actual donkey at all, she knew it was her turn to tell him, far too much. "How are things in Fremantle with Jakob? I got the strangest email." Ah, so that's what Jakob had meant about making her sorry for whatever he'd been upset about the other night. His revenge had involved sending an email to her father, telling Dad she'd gone mad because of all the things she was no longer doing for him. He'd ended the rant with a melodramatic threat that, as he could no longer live with Dad's mad daughter, he'd moved back to his parents' house, and he hoped Rochelle would see sense as she struggled to pay the rent and the bills without him contributing. When she contacted Dad to ask for his help, Jakob implied, and not before, he might be willing to accept her apology for neglecting him, but only if Dad gave him guardianship and power of attorney over Rochelle in case she went mad again. Rochelle wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry. She wished she could remember what she'd ever seen in Jakob, but maybe he'd always been a bit controlling and crazy. "Has he moved out?" Dad asked. "I don't know. I hope so. I've been staying at Tacey's place for a few weeks after he hit me, and I went to the police. The court approved a temporary restraining order, but the day they delivered it, he decided it didn't apply to him and actually came to the cafe to find me. The last time I saw him, he was shouting nonsense as the police hauled him away. I guess I could go around to the house and check to see if he's really gone. It was Gran's house, but for the first time in her life, she didn't want to go anywhere near it. Not if Jakob was going to be there. Don't go alone. Take someone with you. A couple of sumo wrestlers at least. And if he's gone, I want you to change all the locks. Every single one. I'll send you some money for a locksmith, but don't go alone. Promise me, Rochelle. I'll ask my friend Ben. He works at the cafe with me and sort of fills the role of bouncer in the evenings. He's not as big as a sumo wrestler, but he does scare Jakob, which is probably all I need. Good. A long pause. Do I need to meet this Ben fellow? I could come down to Perth, now the restrictions have eased. It would be lovely to see him, but she knew he was needed on the station. There was always a heap of admin to do in the office, after being away for weeks of mustering. I'll be fine, Dad. There's no hurry. I'm really hoping Ben sticks around, and if he does, you'll have plenty of time to meet him. She had a sudden longing to take Ben north, to show him the red dirt station country where she'd grown up. The space and the colors and the wildlife, the things he could paint up there. If he stuck around and didn't get bored with her and find someone else. He had said he loved her and she had no reason not to believe him, but she was fast falling in love with him too, and it would shatter her heart in a million pieces if he left her. She'd only had to see how well he'd gotten along with Callie to know how easily he charmed women. A quick call to Crystal and the other girl agreed to cover her shift that night, so all she had to do was wait for Ben to arrive and also agree. Before they were out of there, headed up the hill to Gran's old house. What did you say or do to Crystal to make her stare daggers at you like that? Rochelle asked as soon as the cafe door had shut behind them. I merely drew her as she made a cup of coffee, like I draw you most nights. However, Crystal has some unusual scars that made it into the picture, so when I left that night to walk you home from the prison, she tore it up. I found the pieces in the rubbish bin. Ben shrugged. I'm sure she has quite an interesting story to tell, but only to someone she trusts, and only when she's ready to do so. Until then, she will probably continue to wear long sleeves. Rochelle hadn't ever noticed that about Crystal before. Huh. You're not like other guys, you know. Most men would just say that she's a bitch, or that she just doesn't like you. But most people wouldn't have noticed scars she's so good at hiding. I mean, I didn't even know. Ben grinned. Funny thing that. Most people like me. They just can't help themselves. When someone doesn't though, it's rarely anything to do with me. Again, on any other man, that kind of overweening self-confidence would have come across as arrogance. From Ben though, and knowing how down-to-earth he was. Rochelle shook her head. Callie certainly liked you. Ben laughed ruefully. Callie seemed more interested in talking about you and trying to matchmake us. She was most insistent that you needed some, good dick as she put it, and she believed I should be the one to give it to you. Rochelle snorted. As if Callie would know good if it danced naked in front of her. She has so many stories about disastrous dates, I'm not sure if she's ever dated a guy for longer than a week. She finds them on dating apps, because everyone at uni thinks she's a witch, and she's threatened to curse most of the staff at one point or another. Oh, and her students, but only if they cheat or plagiarize or any of the things students aren't supposed to do anyway. That scares off most of the people who know her, which leaves her stuck with dating apps and the array of bottom feeders who seem to be attracted to her on them. She did threaten to curse me in at least 4 different ways last night. Particularly if I didn't kiss you. That was... Rochelle fought to find the right word. Considerate of her? No, that wasn't quite right. I thought it was interfering and vulgar, especially when she asked for details about our intimate moments together. I believe she took my silence on the matter to mean we had not shared any intimate moments, which is when she began insisting that we should do so. With a great deal of coarse language. Rochelle hid her smile. It almost sounded like Ben didn't like Callie. You could have told her to bugger off and mind her own business. That's what I did when she tried that on me. Ah. I did not think of that. I was attempting to remain polite, because I wanted her assistance on translating some Latin I wasn't quite sure about. She did translate it in between the other things she said, but I'm still just as puzzled as before. I wish people would be clear instead of using flowery language to hide what they really mean. You and me both. I'm all for plain talking. Instead of lying or making things up or just plain hiding the truth. A tear trickled down her cheek, and she paused to swipe it away. A quick glance at Ben told her he was looking away, so he hadn't seen it. Do you know what my father told me? He said Jacob had contacted him to tell him I was mad, and not to believe a word I said because of it. Did your father believe him? Of course not. Dad's not stupid. He told me to get down to the house and change all the locks. He also told me not to go alone. Rochelle stared at Ben. It's like he thinks Jacob's dangerous when he's all hot air really. He was always such a coward at school. If there was even the slightest whisper of a fight, he'd be off running to the office so the teachers could intervene. That's what first made his gaming videos famous. He used to go in, aggravate a whole mob of bad guys and kite them all over the place, screeching in terror. And that wasn't even real people. I'm not sure he even knows how to throw a punch. He wouldn't actually hurt anyone. Not on purpose. Ben just shook his head. The prison you take tourists through used to house the worst criminals in Western Australia. While some of them were very bad men, the sort who planned their crimes or took great pleasure in them, most of them were there because of a mistake they made. A mistake that cost someone their life. A momentary lapse in judgment. You may not remember, but I do. I saw that boy swing. I saw Jacob's blow take you down and knock you out. Had you landed on the stone step instead of the decking, that one blow might have killed you. Perhaps it was an accident. Perhaps he might never have done such a thing again. A man might regret something so much he never does it again. But that boy came to your new residence, screaming in the streets about how he would have his revenge. He also contacted your father, trying to discredit you. Those are not the actions of an innocent man. They are the actions of a man who started as he means to continue, so drunk on his own power that he will not stop. Perhaps the first blow was not on purpose, but everything he has done since had only one purpose, to hurt you. Ben was right. Dad knew it too. It was just so hard to believe it hurt. But he was my friend. Ben nodded. He was. But people change. I heard a school counselor say to a student this week that when people change, they are becoming the person they wish to be, the person they truly are. Expecting them to change back is like expecting time to run backward. I can never go back to the boy I was before I was arrested. I cannot change what happened. I can only hope the man I have become will not make the same mistakes again, so that one day I might be the man I am meant to be. Slowly, Rochelle nodded too. That's pretty deep. You haven't been smoking anything, have you? Or is the truth that you're really a 1,000-year-old vampire, who only looks like a guy in your early 20s, and that's why you only come out after dark? She laughed at the shock on his face. Sorry, Ben, but I'm sure that's totally the plot of a vampire book I read when I was in high school. She trailed off as they reached the driveway. No light shone out the windows, but that might be because all the blinds and curtains were shut. Gran had insisted all her window coverings should block out the light completely, to keep the heat out in summer. Jacob had always insisted on keeping them closed all the time year-round, because of the strange hours he kept, gaming day and night. Well, here goes nothing. The house is dark, so we could be lucky. She reached out to slot the key in the lock. 64. Inside the house, a stack of unopened envelopes littered the hall table. Rochelle picked one up, looking like she wanted to linger, but Ben knew that was a bad idea. "Let's search the house and see if he's here before you do that. He could be hiding here in the dark, waiting to ambush you." Ben doubted Jacob would have the cunning to do such a thing, but he would not risk Rochelle's safety on a foolish assumption. "Stay behind me just in case." Searching the small cottage didn't take long, and the garden was empty too. The room where Jacob had kept his computer was empty, as was his half of the wardrobe. It appeared he truly had left. Rochelle collected all the envelopes and carried them up to the garden wall, where she climbed up, just like the first night he'd seen her. On this side of the wall, the climb was almost effortless, unlike the precipitous drop on the other side. No wonder she'd chosen it for her eyrie. There was room enough for both of them, so Ben hoisted himself up onto the crumbling limestone too. The view up here was almost as good as the one from the lookout. He should have brought a sketch pad. But as he hadn't, he watched Rochelle instead. She tore open the letters one by one, scanning the contents before shrugging, then setting them down. Envelopes in one pile, letters in another. Until one letter made the color drain from her face as her hands shook. "What is it? Bad news?" Ben pressed. Rochelle wet her lips. "Probably. I don't know. The Vice-Chancellor of the university wants to see me in his office on Monday morning, to discuss my enrollment status. I guess I didn't do as well on my last couple of assignments as I'd thought I did, and if I fail this unit, they'll kick me out. I didn't think they'd bother sending a letter. They'd just lock me out of enrolling in next semester's units, and that would be that. Now I need to meet with the VC and, I guess I'm a little scared. I wish I could come with you. If he was a normal man, he'd be able to. As a gargoyle, not a chance. Yeah, I wish you could too. But seeing as you're a vampire and all." She shrugged. "I'll be fine. Maybe you'll cry a bit, so if my eyes are red when you see me Monday evening, I'm telling you now, I will definitely accept any and all hugs you have to offer. I'll bring a selection for you to choose from. And I believe I will also be able to bring your finished painting." Her eyes lit up. "Really? Oh, that's wonderful. Definitely something to look forward to. As long as you cover it up, because if it's half as raunchy as what you drew on paper, I'm pretty sure it qualifies as not safe for work on a whole lot of levels." He bowed. "As you wish, of course." 65. The locksmith dropped off the keys to the new locks the following day, along with the manual for the new alarm system. "You'll want to change the code on that to something more personal that you'll remember," he said. Rochelle didn't want the alarm system at all, but her father had insisted, and seeing as he'd paid for it. "I will." It was the last on a long line of things she'd have to do, before she moved back into Grant's house. Not least of which was finding time to actually move all her stuff back. Tacy and the others had that girls' night this weekend, which meant she was working for most of it, and none of them would be free to help her, so the earliest she could move back was Monday night. She really wanted to ask Ben to come with her, partially to help, but mostly as moral support in case Jacob turned up, but he was later than usual tonight. The reason for his tardiness followed him in, half an hour later, two men who looked as grim-faced as he did. But the resemblance didn't end there. There was something in the way they walked, and the way they stared around the cafe as though they'd never been inside one before. Which made no sense, because the shut-up cafe was just like dozens of other cafes in Fremantle, and one of millions the world over. Even the espresso machine was older than she was. "Rochelle, I need to beg you for a favor. Something's come up, and my brothers urgently need somewhere to stay for the weekend. My place is little more than an art studio, with nowhere for them to sleep, and I have private commissions to complete over the weekend. Seeing as your house is empty at the moment and you're staying here still, I was wondering if you'd be able to put them up for a few days. I can pay you, and I can vouch for them fixing, cleaning or replacing anything they touch, as necessary. Please, I beg you." He really did look desperate. His brothers were, well, she saw the family resemblance, though one of them was as wide as a sumo wrestler. Ben was easily the handsomest of the three, though the one who wasn't a wrestler did have a roguish wink. Rochelle closed her eyes. She'd let Jakob stay there, rent-free for years, and he'd never paid for anything, let alone fixed or cleaned or replaced stuff. And if Jakob came back over the weekend, angry that she'd changed the locks, it would be nice to have two burly men capable of tossing him out on his ear and telling her about it, instead of letting him frighten the life out of her if she was home alone next week. This was for Ben, the man who'd done countless favors for her every day she'd known him. He was even doing a painting for her, for goodness sake. "All right, but I plan to move back on Monday. If you'll all help me move my stuff on Monday night, I'll consider it a fair trade." Ben seized her by the shoulders and delivered smacking kisses on both her cheeks. "You are the sweetest, kindest woman in the world. Dunstan Torsten, this is Rochelle, your new landlady for the weekend." Her breath caught in her throat. She'd heard those names before. Alarm bells clanged in her head. Something wasn't right. Surely they could stay in a hotel or the backpackers down the street. Why did they need her place? She waited for Ben's brothers to leave, which they did, after giving her a curt nod each in acknowledgement of the introduction, before she leaned over the counter and hissed, "What's going on? Are they doing something dangerous or illegal in my house? Is that why they can't go to a hotel? Your house and your honor is as safe with them as it is with me, I swear to you. They just need somewhere to hide for a few days. It's nothing illegal, I swear on my life." "But there's something going on, isn't there? Why won't you tell me?" They were going to be staying in her house, for fuck's sake. She deserved to know what they were up to. Ben closed his eyes. "Look, I don't want you to panic, all right? But there might be a police investigation at the house across the road from the cafe in the next few days, with forensics and that bright yellow tape, and people asking a lot of questions. It would be best if my brothers and me weren't around here for that. And it might be best if you don't know any of the answers if someone starts asking, if you know what I mean. Ebenezer Stone, if this is something illegal, we are over, you hear me? I might not care about your past, but I do care about your present and whether we have a future, and if you're tied up in drugs or worse, then so help me, there is no future for us." Even if it broke her heart to say it, she would not budge on this. God, just as she was beginning to believe she was in love with Ben too. He grasped her hands. "I swear to you, anything the police find is old news, from long before you were born. My brothers had no hand in any of it. It's old family history that should have been dealt with long ago, but it wasn't, and now we need to be absent for a little while until this blows over." She wanted to believe him. God, the way his eyes peered into her soul, as if he wanted her to read the honesty in his own. But the ideas running through her head, suspicions, really, were impossible. They just could not be. There had to be a reasonable, logical explanation for this, and on Monday night, I'll be coming home to the cottage, and when I do, you're going to tell me everything. What you and your brothers are up to. What you're hiding from. And why a couple hundred years worth of family history might bring the police to my cafe now. Because if you don't, her heart would shatter into a million pieces, and she might never trust another man again. When all this is over and the police are gone, I swear I will tell you everything, he said. Oh, how she wanted to believe him. You'd better. Then more customers came in, and he had commissions to sketch while she had coffee to make, so they were forced to drop the subject. But this would not be the end of it, Rochelle swore. 66. When the sun rose, Ben slumped down into a seat at the kitchen table beside his brothers. With all the blinds pulled down, so little light penetrated Rochelle's house that it was possible for even a gargoyle to spend a day there without turning to stone. "Do you mean to offer for the coffee, girl?" Dunstan asked. "Because you're far too young to consider settling down. Tor and me, we're older, but you're barely 21. No house or job or trade to support a wife or family. Perhaps you should look to attending art school as you meant to back in Scotland. Tor started up a stonework business, so perhaps he can hire you to help him for a while, and then with the money." Ben burst out laughing. The world had changed, but his brothers had not. "What do you think I've been doing all this time, while you two have been sneaking about in the walls of the homes of the women you fancy, spying on them in the shower and such? I've spent my days at art college. The cemetery where the guards buried my body is now the college sports grounds, for the students here learn much more than just art. The civil rights movement and psychology and chemistry and computers, and they now teach art in schools to anyone. This year alone, I've already attended more art classes here than in the rest of my life put together. And I sell more of my work in a night than I did in a year back home in Scotland. The world has changed and it's an amazing place. I don't need your money. I make more than enough of my own, living among the people of this time as one of them. I even have my own phone and email address and everything." He pulled the phone out of his pocket and waved it at them, wondering if either of them knew just how much the device was capable of. Tor frowned. "Is that the device that takes pictures and sends them out into the ether for everyone to see?" Ben nodded. "It's one of them, yes." "If you know so much, how do we break the curse then?" Dunstan demanded. Ben blew out a breath. After his discussions with Callie and a great deal of thought, he had a theory. "We each have to break the patterns that led us to be cursed, and return to the paths we were destined to follow before all of this. The paths the Queen of the Kelpies foretold back home, the night Pamela died." He pointed at Tor. "You were a master stonemason, ready to come to this colony to build it into a beautiful city. The night the butcher turned us into gargoyles, you were broken in body and spirit, not even trusted to break stone, let alone build with it. But now I see the brother who stood before the Queen with me all those years ago. You might think it was betting the archaeologist, but I think it was more than that. You remembered who you are and what you are capable of." Tor looked thoughtful. He likely would for a long time, for he was not one to jump lightly into agreeing with anyone. But he would see it, Ben was sure of it. Ben turned to Dunstan. "You came here, broken-hearted at Kara's betrayal, swearing never to trust a woman again. You even cursed Pamela's name for dying, so that we might be accused of her murder, though she was hardly culpable for the crime, any more than we were. You talk to me of marriage and children and responsibilities, but your advice is as wrong now as it was then. Then you spent all your time apprenticed in the shipyard, before you went to sea. If you'd stayed, maybe you would have been the one to seduce Kara and get her with child, instead of that brute Oscar. She wept after every tumble with him, for he never thought of anything but his own pleasure, and she would have chosen you over him if she'd thought for a moment you were home to stay, but away you went, so she had no choice but to tie herself to him forever." Dunstan's brows drew together. "You and Tor both love to lecture me about Kara and Oscar, but I never saw aught amiss with either of them until she married the man and cast me out. Neither of you have been in love as I have, so you cannot possibly understand what it is to have your heart so shattered. You will never put the pieces back together enough to love another as she truly deserves." "Horsepiss!" Tor snapped. "You never truly loved Kara, for you never really knew her. Now Mistress Anemone, I've seen how you look at her. It's no different to how you used to look at Kara, only Anemone is every bit as sweet as she appears. God's teeth, man, she's carrying your child." "Wait, gargoyles can side children? Good thing he and Rochelle had used those condom things then. Damned uncomfortable, and they smelled strange, but he'd use a box of them every night until they agreed they were ready for children. If Rochelle didn't see him off when she learned what he truly was, if only he could find a way to lift the curse before Monday. Dunstan laid a heavy hand on Ben's shoulder. I suppose you are a man now, so you should know that whenever you bed a woman, there is always the possibility of conceiving a child. You see your seed. Ben shoved Dunstan's hand away. Don't bother, brother. I'd wager every penny I've made selling my art in this time that there's nothing you can tell me about sex that I don't know already, and that if I shared even a tenth of what I know about sex between a man and a woman with the two of you, both Katina and Anemone will tie you to their beds and not let you leave their bedchamber ever again. That wasn't even including other kinds of couplings, which Ben had seen but never tried. Dunstan folded his arms across his chest. If you know so much then, little brother, tell me this, how do I break the curse? Ben thought hard. I think that in the end it will be up to you, but I'm sure you will need to let go of your bitterness about Kara, forgive yourself for the mistakes you make then, and resolve to do better as a husband to Anemone and father to whatever children she might bear you. But in order for the curse to break, you will have to make sure all of this is in keeping with the lady's desires too, which I cannot begin to know. Dunstan grunted, but he didn't appear to want to argue. And what of you then? Ben sighed and spread his hands out on the table. I don't know. Unlike the two of you, I've never truly left the Queen's path. I am here, working on my art and headed for happiness. I may have strayed a little in the pursuit of vengeance, first for what I thought was the death of my brothers, and secondly for Pamela's murder, but fate has had things all her way as usual. Brandon died horribly at the hand of Burke himself, before Burke took his own life, I have since discovered. Fitting justice for them both. Pierce, if that is his body in the secret cellar, then he met his end at the bottom of a privy, buried beneath a pile of shit beside the stolen gold he never got to enjoy. Justice surely, and at my hand, or perhaps my foot, as it was I who kicked him and knocked him off the ladder. I am an artist, like I always wanted to be, and if my patron is an ordinary woman who owns a cafe instead of some rich lord, then fate is smiling on me for once, because Tacy has never once made me feel inferior, for my presence in her cafe benefits her business as much as mine. I do not know what else there is left for me to do. Tor straightened. The Queen spoke of an heiress and gold. Perhaps you need these in order to break the curse. Ben shrugged. We already found the gold right there in the secret cellar. The police will likely return it to the rightful owner. Perhaps the Queen believed I would take it for my own, or that we would share it between us, and I admit I considered it, but it is so much harder to hide things in this time of computers and cameras and an internet that links the world in a blink of an eye. As for an heiress, perhaps she spoke of Pamela and how I would make peace with Pamela's ghost, for the only woman I see in my future is Rochelle if she will have me, and she is just a poor student, making coffee and working at the prison in every spare moment. Or maybe fate has more twists in store for me, as she usually does. Maybe Rochelle will reject me, and I have yet to meet this heiress, so I will remain cursed for some time longer while I watch my brothers seek happiness with the women of their heart. Both his brothers reached for Ben and each patted a shoulder. You'll always be welcome with one of us, little brother, Tor said. Dunstan nodded. Anemone has bedchambers for guests that no one ever sleeps in but her cat, and the cat will be most upset if I break the curse and she no longer has a gargoyle to curl up to. You may entertain her cat while she and I are otherwise occupied in her bedchamber. She likes neck scratches, but you are not permitted to touch her belly. Ben wasn't sure if he was referring to Anemone or her cat, but he would heed the warning all the same, and avoid touching the belly of either female. 67. Between working extra shifts all weekend and not seeing Ben at all since the night he'd come in with his brothers, by Monday, Rochelle just wanted to burrow back under the covers and hide from the world. But she knew she couldn't. She had to attend that meeting with the Vice-Chancellor, in case there was any way she could beg him for one more chance to let her keep studying for another semester. Sure, the chances he'd agree were slim to none, but if she didn't go, she'd be kicked out for sure. So she squeezed into the one business suit she owned, which she hadn't worn since her disastrous office internship last year. She'd known before the internship that she wasn't cut out to work for some big corporate firm, with marketing budgets the size of a small country's GDP, but whose idea of something fresh was an ad they'd seen last century for a product that had tanked then and wasn't likely to have a comeback anytime soon. No, she'd done her best work for Tacy's Cafe actually, or some of the short films she'd helped produce and promote when she'd first started university. Before Mum had died and her luck had gone sour. When her film projects had started to go missing the year Mum died, the university had sympathized with her loss and given her plenty of leeway on deadlines and the quality of her work. But that time was over, though her luck hadn't changed much for the better. With the exception of the last month or so, she honestly didn't think it could have gotten much worse, even if things were about to now. Rochelle sighed. Well, at least she still had a job, too, if you counted the prison, and somewhere to live, even if getting kicked out of uni lost her Grand's cottage. She'd have to look for a new place to live, or she'd have to move back up north to the cattle station. Something to worry about after her shift, and after this meeting. Rochelle took a deep breath. Hi, I'm Rochelle Burke. I have a meeting with the Vice-Chancellor, she said to the elegantly dressed receptionist who guarded access to the plush offices beyond. The woman's eyes widened. Oh, Miss Burke. Yes, he said, to show you right through. Such a terrible, terrible thing to happen, and all over the news too. Rochelle gulped. She'd been too busy to even check the news for days, and watching the police set up their marquees and caution tape over the road, just as Ben had predicted, had sent her scurrying away from any mention of what they were investigating. When customers asked about it, she just shrugged and told them she had no idea. Because the ideas she did have alternated between terrible, impossible, and otherwise unbelievable. She'd been bagging up a muffin for Anemone when she glimpsed the police helping to load a body bag into the back of an ambulance. Anemone had noticed her preoccupation, glanced at the ambulance, then said, I know. My neighbor Katina almost had a heart attack when she first found it. Who'd have believed it was buried in my basement all those years? I've been rushing out early and coming home late, so I don't accidentally see what else they find down there. Miss Burke? Rochelle blinked, dragging her thoughts back to the present. Oh yes, terrible, she murmured, hoping that was the right response. Right through the door over there. The receptionist pointed. Rochelle tapped timidly on it, until the man sitting at the desk looked up. Yes? I'm Rochelle Burke, she said. His eyes widened. Oh. Thank you so much for coming. If you would please close the door? Well, it was probably best the receptionist didn't hear her beg to be allowed another chance. She was going to see her run out in tears anyway, which was bad enough. Please take a seat, Miss Burke. Yes, because if she gripped the arms of the chair tightly enough, she'd be able to stop her hands from shaking. The Vice-Chancellor steepled his hands together, then took a deep breath. I wish to assure you that nothing like this has ever happened in the almost 30 years since this university first opened. That it has happened at all has shocked every member of staff here. To have it brought to our attention by the media instead of coming through official channels, where the matter might be handled discreetly to the satisfaction of all parties, well, it's too late for that now. He regarded her with something that looked like disappointment. Her heart sank. Too late. I understand, she said, though she didn't. What was she supposed to have done? Come in to beg earlier instead of actually working on her assignments and trying to achieve good enough results. She didn't want to get better results from whining, she wanted to be judged on her merits. To know she was good enough to graduate, and do what her degree had trained her for. But it was too late, and if she stayed here a moment longer with him judging her for her failure, she was going to cry and she wasn't sure she'd ever stop. Rochelle jumped to her feet. Thank you for your time, sir. Please sit down, Miss Burke. I beg you. Just because the university has allowed this to happen does not mean it cannot be set right, however late it might be. I still hold out hope that we can reach a mutually beneficial outcome, without further negative media. As a student of commerce and communications and media, I'm sure you understand more than anyone that it is the outcome and the message conveyed by it that matters more than what might have happened. A student who would never graduate unless he was offering her the chance to continue, for even this faint hope, Rochelle was willing to do as she was told. At least the chair was comfortable. What do you propose? The words were calm and composed, sounding so professional Rochelle could hardly believe they'd come out of her lips. But if the vice-chancellor was offering her something, she'd be an idiot to refuse. At least until she knew what he was asking in return. First, for his blatant disregard of the university's code of conduct, Mr. Tollick will be stripped of his degree and denied enrollment or credit for any of his studies at any university in Australia. Jacob? This wasn't about her own failures, but something Jacob had done? Something so bad they'd actually strip him of his degree? That had to be serious cheating or plagiarism or something like that. Just so we're on the same page here, can you tell me exactly which parts of the code of conduct Jacob violated to deserve this? Rochelle asked. The vice-chancellor coughed. Well, it appears he stole your work and submitted it under his own name for most of his degree, while your records show you requested an extension due to your assignment files being lost due to computing or technical errors. Clearly, this is blatant cheating and plagiarism of the worst kind. If you had submitted the assignments you had originally completed, it would have been obvious to the lecturers and the matter would have been dealt with, but because you never submitted them, it went unnoticed. Hang on, Jacob had done what? So you're trying to pin this on me? Say it's my fault Jacob was a lying, cheating, stealing. She shouldn't swear, she really shouldn't, but there were no nice words for what Jacob was, so she settled on, douchebag? The vice-chancellor winced. Not at all, Miss Burke. You merely asked me the extent of his violations, and I have told you. This does not begin to make up for the consequences to you from his theft, or from his actions after he obtained his degree. This whole mess started when Mr. Tollick admitted on his rather public video channel that he has been stealing your assignments from your cloud drive, stating that he had done so in order to save academic staff from being subjected to the low standard of your work, before proceeding to publicly post examples of these assignments, which bear a startlingly close resemblance to his own submitted work. Several of your tutors brought the matter to the relevant unit coordinators, by which time the media had caught on to the possible scandal this might embroil the university in, and they contacted our public relations office for a statement. He smiled thinly. I'm sure you can imagine what our statement was. That the university will conduct a full investigation into this matter, and will issue a media statement when there is something further to report, Rochelle said. She'd had to repeat the unit on public relations twice, thanks to Jacob, if the vice-chancellor was to be believed. Precisely. I see why the staff and students at this university hold you in such high regard, Miss Burke, and were willing to champion you in this matter. I believe there were even rumors of the university being cursed, if we did not act. Callie. That had to be Callie. Rochelle would have to hug her when she saw her next. Over the last few days, we have conducted a full investigation, and the outcome put forward by your advocates on the academic staff might surprise you. Rochelle crossed all her fingers. Hell, she even tried to cross her toes inside her shoes. If he was about to tell her she could stay on next semester and not get kicked out. Based on the reassessment of your unsubmitted work, due to theft, it appears that you have not only achieved sufficient credit points to be awarded a Bachelor of Media and Communications and, pending your grades from this semester, which I understand are not yet final but I have on good authority, are sufficient to ensure you will pass all your units, it is likely that you will also meet the requirements to graduate with a Bachelor of Commerce in Advertising and Marketing, too. May I be the first to congratulate you on achieving a double degree? He rose and offered her his hand. Rochelle didn't take it. At what price? For everything had a price, and 2 university degrees did not come cheap. He hadn't offered to waive her fees for them, after all. Why, preventing future unpleasantness, of course. The PR office has prepared a media statement, and they would like to include a quote from you about how happy you are about the outcome. We would also like assurances that you will make no further statement to the media, beyond the written one we will issue. The price was her silence. Part of her didn't want to be silent. If this could happen to her, it could happen to anyone. She hadn't seen it. What if making all this public helped someone else? Then again, Jakob had made things plenty public, and if she gave any interviews, she was bound to admit she'd had no idea about any of this until now. She'd look a right idiot for not realizing Jakob had been sabotaging her all along, not some mysterious hacker or a simple computer fault. So much for a degree earned on merit. Then again, did the unit coordinators really assess all my assignments? Even the ones I didn't submit? The Vice-Chancellor nodded. Mr. Tollick made every single one of them public, so they could see the ones he submitted were exact copies of yours, with only the names changed. He was awarded a number of high distinctions for your work, Miss Burke. Enough to earn his degree easily, with an enviable grade point average too. Her GPA, not his. Or at least it would be, if she agreed to this. The offer is a limited one, as I'm sure you understand, Miss Burke. Once you leave this room, the offer is no longer on the table. He ducked his head. For what it's worth, I do believe you should take it. You have earned both degrees, no question. My offer is no more and no less than you deserve. I only wish we were in a position to offer you more. I mean, with your new stellar grade point average, you would have a very good chance applying for an honors year in either of your chosen disciplines. Research and academia, no, she had no desire to go there. Not even to be a lecturer like Callie. Rochelle rose to her feet once more. If I accept your offer, when will the graduation ceremony be? In July, I believe. You'd have to check the university website for the date. I know it's in my calendar as I have to be there, but I have a lot of appointments, so things can get lost in there sometimes. He paused. So, am I to understand that you are accepting the university's offer? This time she shook his hand. Yes. And you can tell your PR office or whoever's preparing the media release that I thank the university staff for your quick resolution of this matter, and I'm delighted at the outcome. She might not be so delighted once she'd seen and heard what Jakob had said to make it happen, but that could wait until she got home. Right now, she felt like her luck had definitely changed. 68. Monday at the cafe was surprisingly quiet, allowing Rochelle to have the place packed up for closing exactly on 7 that evening. As all her things still only fitted in one suitcase, she took a taxi up to the cottage, without bothering to call Ben or his brothers for help. Not that she had any of their numbers, something she needed to fix if she intended to continue seeing Ben. God, that was the question, wasn't it? She'd been just about walking on air when she left the Vice-Chancellor's office, and a quick call to her father to tell him the good news and invite him down to Perth for her graduation had done nothing to dim her spirits, but now she remembered the plethora of police investigating Anemone's basement, and Ben's promised explanations. She took a deep breath and blew it out. There had to be a perfectly logical explanation for all of this, which he would surely tell her soon enough. The crazy ideas flying through her head would simmer down or disappear entirely, and she'd be able to introduce Ben to her father as her new boyfriend at her graduation. Better yet, tonight she could celebrate the good news with Ben. Yes. Focus only on the best-case scenario and not all the other things that could happen. The key turned smoothly in the lock, a nice change after the incessant jiggling and swaying she'd had to do with Gran's locks. Rochelle rolled her suitcase into the entry and bumped the door shut again with her backside. The gloom engulfed her. Had Ben and his brothers gone to bed already? Or maybe they'd gone out. Or maybe... Here, let me help you with that. Ben was there, in the sudden glow from the hastily switched-on hall light, taking her suitcase from her. Where do you want it? In the bedroom. He wheeled it away, without even pausing to kiss her. This did not bode well. She'd brought some food, mostly leftovers from the cafe, so she headed to the kitchen to put everything away. Jacob, or Ben's brothers, had evidently cleaned the fridge out of whatever food she'd left when she decamped to the studio above the cafe. Even the ice trays in the freezer were empty, though some kind soul had left the empty trays there, perhaps in the hope that they'd magically fill themselves. At least there was still tea left in the tin. Jacob wouldn't have touched it, and while Ben's brothers might drink tea, they evidently hadn't found hers. She set the kettle on to boil, then turned to find Ben seated at the table, looking like a man about to be led to the gallows. Before we begin this interrogation, may I ask you a few questions? Ben said. I promise they will not be too personal. She shrugged. You can ask. On the nights you sat up on the wall behind your house, did you ever see any weird rituals being performed on the sports ground at night? That definitely wasn't a question she'd expected. What, you mean like witchcraft or satanic rituals on the school oval? No, why? Well, it used to be a cemetery before it was a school, and a cemetery is the sort of place people might do that sort of thing. I figured if they had been, you might have noticed. Rochelle shuddered. Seriously? There's a cemetery behind this house? Underneath the school oval. That's just ugh. I'm never going to have a good night's sleep here again. The gravestones have been moved to the new cemetery, but the bodies remain, I'm afraid. At least most of them do. Did you ever hear or see anything strange there? He really wanted to know. Rochelle thought hard, but she had to shake her head. Believe me, if I'd known about the cemetery or seen anything like that, I probably would have thrown rocks at them until they went away. Especially if Jacob had pissed me off that night, which was pretty much every night toward the end. Ben nodded for a moment, before his eyes widened as if he'd just had a sudden thought. What sort of stones and how far can you throw them? Small chunks of limestone that have chipped off the wall or were left over from building the house. None bigger than my fist. And I don't usually throw them at people, but I might if I thought they were up to something nefarious. How far? He pressed. This really mattered to him. Usually just across the road. On nights when it rains, the whole road turns into a lake, and I skim stones across it. When I'm really pissed off, I just lob them as far as I can, over the road and the wall on the other side and right onto the oval. Not when anyone's using it obviously, but late at night, when no one's there. I was angry, all right? So it's possible that you threw a stone from atop your wall here and it landed on one of the old graves, then bounced off into the grass, leaving no trace of its passage except perhaps to complete a spell on the poor soul buried beneath. Ben mused. Rochelle had to laugh. Well, it's possible if you believe in magic and spells and such things. I certainly don't. I mean, I might have filmed the Mothman, but even I know he's just a guy in a suit. Ben sighed. Then what I'm about to tell you might be difficult to believe, but I swear to you, on my life and yours, that it is the truth. And the fact that I am here at all, sitting at your kitchen table talking to you, is because I am the monster you made me, accidental though your actions might be. Then, when I was 16, my brother and I were engaged to build a castle. 69. So the Mothman you filmed is not one man but two, and neither of them was wearing a suit, or anything at all, Ben finished. Rochelle's mind was whirling far too fast for her to catch up. She'd gone from the possibility of being kicked out of uni and becoming homeless, to graduating and a homeowner, and now her boyfriend thought he was a monster? Not just the sociopath kind, but an actual paranormal creature. It was too much. "Please say something," Ben begged. She wasn't sure what to say, but then the words sort of spilled out of her and she couldn't seem to stop them. "You and your brothers came here in 1852 as convicts, convicted." "Wrongly convicted," he chimed in. "Right, wrongly convicted of the murder of Miss Pamela Burke, the girl whose statue I saw in Scotland, which you carved while you were building her father's castle." "A folly. A castle ruin folly. A fake ruin that now sits beside the real ruin that I visited. And you came here, built the prison and a bunch of other things, before you escaped with the help of a butcher, who turned out to be an evil butcher who put a spell on you. On all three of us, but I woke up and fought back, so he didn't finish casting the curse on me and the guards found me in the street and buried me in the cemetery instead, where you woke me with a fortuitously thrown rock." Rochelle sighed. "So thanks to me and this evil butcher, you and your brothers were turned into gargoyles who woke up in the present day as protectors. You can't go out in daylight, or you turn to stone, you don't eat or drink, which is why you've been pouring all the coffees I make you into the pot plants, and you hole up all day in the attic of the art college behind my house, painting commissions that you sell in the cafe where I work at night. Ben, you know this sounds crazy, right? You filmed the Mothmen. You've seen them." At Rochelle's raised eyebrows he continued, "My brothers. Tor, the one who vanished by taking that girl inside the wall, and Dunstan, who danced on the roof." "Wait, you can walk through walls?" He frowned. "Did I not tell you that? How do you think I left the cafe every morning before dawn, without leaving the door unlocked?" She hadn't really thought about it, but evidently she should have. "I don't know, but I didn't think you were walking through the bloody walls. Like a ghost. Like a dead man." Which is what he was or should be if he'd been born in 1834, like he'd said. She buried her face in her hands. This was too much. "At least let me give you the painting." The painting of them together, having wild, glorious sex in front of the mirror. When he'd looked dark and mysterious, and like he wanted to devour her. She opened her eyes and there it was, the most erotic picture she'd ever seen. One look melted right through her underwear and possibly the chair she was sitting on too. She could almost feel him inside her again, driving her toward orgasm after orgasm as she screamed his name. The best sex of her life. And then he put another painting on the table. Almost the same as the first, except for him. In the second painting he had horns. And wings. And was that a tail? This is what you saw. What you wanted. But this was the monster who possessed you that night, not caring a whit for anything but his own pleasure. This is my picture, my memory of that night. He held them up side by side for a moment, before pushing the one with the man across the table to her, and hugging the monster to his own chest. "Forgive me, for you gave me the best night of my miserable life, though I do not deserve it, nor any of the nights you gave me after it, especially when I was supposed to be your protector. I fell in love with you that night, and I forgot who and what I was, and I did, the unforgivable." She studied both pictures, comparing one to the other. There were slight differences, as you'd expect from two hand-painted canvases, but it was the similarities that struck her. She was exactly the same in both, her head resting on his shoulder as she cried out in ecstasy. And the man, for with a dick like that he was every inch a man, was built exactly the same. Every muscle outlined in glorious detail in the mirror, though the massive leathery wings framed the foreground of the monster picture. He looked like a demon, but he was still Ben. She reached out to touch the wings, as if by stroking the canvas she might know what the monster's wings felt like. Rochelle shook her head. This was silly. Either this was his visual representation of how he saw himself, or he truly believed he was this monster, and he needed professional help. "Show me," she said. Show me the monster. Ben nodded, then rose from his seat. Slowly he stripped off his shirt, followed by everything else, leaving a neat little pile of clothes on the chair. When he stood there as gloriously naked as the man in her painting, he asked, "Are you sure?" Rochelle closed her eyes. Now she had a hot naked man in her kitchen, a man who claimed to be her protector. If he stood there naked much longer, she was going to climb him like a tree whether he was a monster or not. Then, before I show you, I want you to know I'm doing everything I can to break the curse. My brother Torsten's managed it, and Dunstan and I have spent all weekend trying to work out how to be human again. We will work it out, I promise. She fixed her gaze on him. Show me the monster, Ben. One moment she was staring at him. Then she wasn't, and yet she was. Because he had wings. Whoa. Horns and wings and a tail and… Are those ridges on your cock? She stepped forward to wrap her hand around it, just to be sure. All those times we did it with you like a normal man, when you could have been giving me this? He grinned. Actually, I did. You just thought it was the condom. Oh my God. She'd been having the best sex of her life with a monster who had a magic cock, and he was Ben. Her mouth was dry. Her brain was screaming at her that none of this was possible, but her hands were telling her otherwise. His horns were rough and sharp. His wings were soft as well-worn leather. His tail swished as sinuously as any snake, before it circled her waist and pulled her closer, a steel band she could not escape. Not even if she wanted to. His chest was hot and hard with muscle, just the same as the man. And his cock, rock hard and ready for her. I want that, she said, pointing at the monster picture. My painting? That too. But first, she wanted to feel it for herself. Wild sex with a monster in front of the mirror. With you. But what if I hurt you? You won't. She'd never been more certain of anything in her life. She led him to the bathroom, struggling to shed her clothes one-handed along the way. When the last scrap of fabric was gone, she pressed her hands against the mirror, pushing her butt against his groin. I want you. And I want you, but I'm a monster, Rochelle. Now do you believe me? Yes and no. He was still Ben, and… I know that I want you. Oh my God, that cock. Spearing deep inside her, rubbing against her most sensitive spots until he filled her. Hard and fast, just like before. Only this time, it seemed like only seconds before the first explosive orgasm blew her away. When her vision cleared, he twined his tail around her waist, pinning his hips to hers. His clawed hands cupped her breasts. Now do you believe I'm a monster, Rochelle? She clenched down hard on that wondrous dick, making them both gasp before she grinned. You're my monster, and I love you, and I want you to do that again, but this time don't stop. Much later, when her wobbly legs refused to hold her up anymore, Ben carried her to bed, wrapping her up in his arms and his wings, and she'd never felt so well protected or so loved. When she awoke in the pre-dawn light, she was still in his arms, though the wings and other monstrous appendages were gone. All except for his monster cock, because that was hardly a curse at all. 70. Several weeks later, Ben and Rochelle accepted an invitation to dinner at Anemone's house. It was just Ben, his two brothers, and Anemone and Katina, the girl who owned the other flat in the building where Anemone lived. When Rochelle said Katina looked vaguely familiar, Katina had just laughed and said no one ever noticed the university librarians. Anemone served the pasta, setting out 6 plates of food as if she already knew. Did you tell her? Rochelle asked, but Ben shook his head. Only Rochelle knew about his newfound ability to walk in sunlight, which had come with the loss of his wings, and the ability to walk through walls. He'd had to buy new painting materials, as he couldn't return to his secret studio in the college ceiling after that first night he'd spent with Rochelle in her cottage. And it was her cottage. Her father had explained after her graduation ceremony that Gran had promised it to her and her mother after Rochelle graduated, but after her mother's death, the cottage in its entirety would pass to Rochelle. Which it had this week. "Wait, what about Dunstan? Are you?" Ben burst out. Dunstan grinned. "Anemone had her first ultrasound this week. It's the most ingenious device that allows you to see a baby actually in the womb. Or in our case both babies, we're having twins. What with the risk of what happened last time, I can't let sunlight stop me from protecting her if she needs me. It was almost like magic. One night I made the decision to do anything it took to break the curse, and the next morning it was gone." "So is that the reason for this dinner party then? To celebrate the twins?" Rochelle asked. Katina shook her head. "The police contacted us this week, regarding their investigation of the basement. You see, there's a law about lost and found items. It usually refers to cash, but the gold in this case is a lot like currency, in that it's almost impossible to trace the owner. If the rightful owner doesn't identify him or herself to claim the currency in question within a particular period of time, then apparently it's finders keepers for whoever found it. Now we all know Ben found it, but because we had to tell the police it was us instead and we own the property, officially all that gold now belongs to me and Katina," Anemone said. She held up a hand when Ben opened his mouth to protest. "I know that's not fair and God knows I don't need it, but it's a great deal of money, so it's not like you can just cash the gold in and tuck the notes into your wallet. You'd need a bank account and proper identification, and that kind of money gets noticed, which is why I propose we divide it into 6 shares and form a trust. Perhaps we can cash in some of the gold and place the rest in safe deposit at a bank. That's what we're here to discuss." 5 heads nodded, but Rochelle looked lost. "What gold are you talking about?" Ben grimaced. He might have forgotten to mention that part. "The butcher turned us into gargoyles to protect a heap of gold he'd stolen from what I believe is the goldfields in Victoria. When I confronted him about it, he only said 2 words, Nelson and Williamstown, neither of which were the names of any of the goldfields towns. Unless Nelson was a man." In a moment, Rochelle, Katina and Anemone had their phones out, swiping furiously. Anemone let out a whoop. "Got it. The Nelson was a ship, lying offshore at Williamstown in 1852, when 8,000 ounces of gold or thereabouts was stolen from it, and never recovered. The owner at the time was the British government, and their present Prime Minister is too much of an idiot to notice anything going on over here. No wonder no one tried to claim it." Rochelle paled. 8,000 ounces? What's that in metric measurements? Not that it matters. At the current price of gold, that's more than $20 million, Anemone said. More than any one person needs, which is why I propose we share it. Of course you boys will need to procure some sort of identity documents. I wouldn't know where to start with such things though. Rochelle looked thoughtful. "I'm sure Octavia will know someone. I'll ask her when I see her next." More nodding. They quickly hashed out the details as they finished their dinner, and they'd reached an agreement before dessert. When Rochelle carried in the cake she'd bought from the cafe, she found the brothers deep in discussion. "You know, it's funny. Father filled our head with dreams about how we'd be rich men once we came to the Swan River colony, but the idea wasn't his. It was from Mother's brother, Uncle Stanley, that he caught the Swan River fever. Uncle Stanley and several other men from Mother's family went over with the first colonists. We received one letter from him, telling Father to apprentice us into building trades and to make sure that we could sail and farm, for such skills were sorely needed in the colony, and then nothing. I tried asking about him when we came here, but no one had heard of Stanley Steele," Dunstan said. Ben shrugged. I was too young to remember. Tor laughed. Indeed. I don't think you were even born yet. I remember promising Uncle Stanley that I would build him a castle in the colony when I arrived. I wonder what happened to him. Anemone leaned in. We could try searching for him like we did for Ben. At least we might be able to find what cemetery he was buried in. Katina's eyes lit up. Ooh, Alethea's company has just started excavating one of the earliest colonial cemeteries in East Perth. I bet she'll know where to look. And she's giving a presentation at the university tomorrow, along with the archaeologists working on the prison commissariat. I'd planned to go and I figured you might too. She nodded at Anemone. Why don't we all go and you boys can ask her yourselves? Ben looked askance at Rochelle. She shrugged. Sure, why not? 71. Dunstan fought not to fall asleep during the presentations. Lots of people talking, using big words, describing bits of bone and even nail clippings as though they were buried treasure. If Anemone and the other lady scholars hadn't been so interested, he would never have agreed to go. Suddenly Anemone dug her elbow into his ribs. Go on, she whispered. Dunstan focused on the stage at the front of the room. Any questions? The woman with the microphone asked. Dunstan raised his hand. If you were looking for an ancestor, someone who might have been buried in that cemetery, where would you suggest I start looking? The microphone passed to a girl who didn't look much older than Ben. If you come to see me afterwards, I can give you the details of the records I'd suggest you search through first. We use the same method to determine our excavation plans for the Bronte Street site. Even if there is no gravestone remaining, we still might be able to identify the spot where your ancestor is buried. If he was a Scotsman like yourself, maybe I'll get to see him as part of our excavation, or his skeleton at least. Polite laughter followed this remark. Dunstan frowned. I don't want his bones. I want to know what happened to him. Anemone hushed him. If we find out when he died and where he was buried, it's a start. I mean, all we have is the name of the ship he arrived on and the date at present. If you really want to know your ancestor's final resting place, get that information from her and I'll help you. When the talking was over and people began to wander over to the buffet, Dunstan marched up to the girl. Unfortunately, another man had reached her first, so he had to wait. Glaring daggers at the other man's back didn't seem to do him any damage at all. If anything, it only made the man monopolize the girl for longer. Finally he stepped to the side and bowed to the girl. Then he turned to leave. Dunstan's heart dropped into his boots as he came face to face with the man, who was the spitting image of Uncle Stanley, he croaked. This has been Broken Dreams, a Paranormal Protector Tale. Book 3 in the Heart of Stone series. Written by Demelza Carlton. Autonarrated by AI Charlotte from Google.